Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the What If guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Issei Became the Ultimate Dragon. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Hyoudou Issei was very excited. In a few minutes, his new girlfriend Amano Yuma would arrive and their first date would begin. He was also a little nervous. It was his first time dating a girl and he had no idea what was appropriate for a first romantic outing. He had, of course, prepared as best he could by researching what to do and what not to do from the internet, books, films, anime, and manga. He did not want to make a fool of himself in front of his girlfriend or, worse, drive her away. That last possibility worried him because he struggled with persistent, inappropriate impulses that he feared could sabotage the relationship. Those impulses had roots in his childhood. As a child, he had been exposed to corrupt behavior that left him with tendencies he later had to confront. A psychologist had suggested that these patterns had become deeply ingrained, almost like a second brain driving certain reactions. The doctor warned that, unless he learned to manage them, those tendencies might shape his adolescence. The prediction had, in many ways, come true. As he grew up, Issei became aware of his unusual fixation and worked to rein it in. He did not give up the fight. Since he could not entirely eliminate his impulses, he focused on controlling them and making them less disruptive. He threw himself into physical training, a lot of sports and martial arts, because the discipline and inner calm those practices taught helped him maintain self-control. Vigorous exercise also eased the tension he sometimes felt. There was, however, a vicious cycle. The fitter he became, the more he had to train to feel settled. His body was far from that of an average student. He could have competed at a high level if he had wanted to, but he lacked the motivation to pursue athletics professionally. He also buried himself in study. Not out of charity but as a practical way to avoid dwelling on distracting thoughts. If he allowed himself to ruminate, he feared he would accomplish nothing all day. His efforts paid off. His grades improved significantly. He could honestly consider himself above average in both intellect and physical condition. Over time, Issei developed routines and mental strategies to limit intrusive thoughts to private times when they would not interfere with school or social life. The method was imperfect. Certain triggers could still break the fragile balance he had built, but it was better than nothing. Most of the time, he could focus on classes while at school. Several years later, Issei found himself at Jusqu'au Academy. Choosing that school had been a calculated risk. Until the previous year it had been a girls' school. Now it was coeducational, but about 90% of the students were female. When he heard that, his impulses urged him to enroll. He had to take responsibility for why he was there and remind himself of his reasons. Jusqu'au Academy did offer several advantages for Issei. The first was that it was an excellent school. Academically, the diploma was internationally recognized. The second reason for staying was that if he could manage his impulses here, in a place with so many attractive young people, then he could do it anywhere. It was a personal challenge he intended to meet, even if he had had to make a few compromises with himself. That, however, was not important right now. What mattered was that he had finally mustered the courage to take the next step in controlling those impulses. Amano Yuma, a girl he had never met before, had asked him to be her boyfriend. Both parts of his mind had agreed at once. That had happened the day before, and now it was time to make their relationship real with this first date. He hoped he had enough self-control to see it through. He had worked for years to manage himself, and he was determined to act normally until the end. Issei muttered nervously as he checked a distant clock. Then his attention was suddenly diverted by a voice. A young woman had handed him a leaflet while dressed in a bat-themed cosplay. He accepted it without thinking and noticed only briefly that she had smiled and left before either of his minds had time to react. He turned the paper over in his hand, embarrassed, and thought it looked like a scam. Yuma then called his name, and Issei turned to see her. Her violet eyes shone, long black hair fell to her hips, and her slender figure made a striking impression. He noticed she was a little shorter than him, something he had missed the first time in his surprise at her request. She wore a modest light purple jacket and a short black skirt that put him at ease. Issei greeted her with obvious happiness, and Yuma asked apologetically if she had made him wait. He reassured her that he had just arrived and felt delighted. Their date began, and it went even better than Issei had expected. It felt like a pleasant outing with enjoyable company. They visited a clothing store where Yuma helped him try on various outfits. A particularly silly t-shirt that made her laugh showed a comically muscular torso with an odd slogan in kanji that roughly translated to, "You hear the voice of truth in the morning. I am glad even if I must die tonight." Issei persuaded Yuma to try on some clothes as well. She hesitated at first but quickly enjoyed the process. He deliberately suggested modest items so the experience remained light and comfortable. At the end of the shopping trip, Issei bought a pink scrunchy bracelet for Yuma, saying it brought out her eyes, and she blushed in a very sweet way. Later she wanted to get ice cream. She ate it in her own charming manner. He focused on staying calm and collected, and the afternoon continued without incident. They spent the rest of the afternoon together until the sun began to set. Yuma led Issei to a park that felt especially romantic in the fading light. He reached for her hand and gently squeezed. She responded, and he noted how soft her skin felt. Yuma said she had enjoyed the day, and Issei agreed enthusiastically. She then let go of his hand, ran a few steps ahead, and stood before a fountain with her arms behind her back, turning to face him. She looked so adorable that Issei felt the moment become almost magical. Yuma asked him for a favor since it was their first date. Issei wondered if she meant a kiss and felt his heart race at the thought, but he was primarily concerned with being respectful and not ruining the moment. A short, quiet pause followed as they both considered what to do next. He was stronger than that. He had spent almost half his life fighting his impulses. He could do it. He just had to be careful. Issei Hyoudou asked what she wanted, his cheeks flushing slightly. Yuma Amano asked with a gentle smile whether he could die for her. Issei answered without hesitation that of course he could. He meant it. He believed that because they were a couple, it was his duty to protect her from all danger. If that required risking his life, he would do it. He would make sure nothing ever happened to her. Yuma smiled, but the sadness in her eyes contradicted her words. Issei had no time to probe that contradiction before a soft pink aura enveloped her and her appearance shifted into a mysterious, dark battle outfit that included a spiked epaulette, black wings, thigh-high boots, and long gloves. The bracelet he had given her remained unchanged on her wrist. Issei went momentarily stunned, his thoughts clouded. He froze, unsure how to react, and watched. Yuma said, in a lower, more resonant voice, that being his girlfriend had been fun, even if it had been short, and that she would take care of the bracelet. She reached out, and a violet-pink light formed in her hand, coalescing into a lance of pure energy. Issei managed a single word, calling her name. Yuma apologized softly and asked him to die. Then she threw the lance. The spear struck Issei in the torso. He reacted out of years of martial training, bracing his core and trying to stop it from passing through him, but the blow still left him grievously wounded. The weapon vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Issei felt the cold reality of injury and struggled to stay upright. Pain sharpened his thoughts. He pressed his hands to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, yet he knew the damage was severe. He was only delaying the inevitable. Yuma watched him work without intervening, her expression unreadable because she believed he could not survive the attack. Issei managed to ask why. Yuma repeated her apology and explained, with regret and a weary expression, that his existence posed a potential danger because of the sacred gear he carried. She said she did not want to do it, but she had felt she had no choice. She placed responsibility on God, who had introduced the sacred gear into his life. Yuma thanked him for the memories they had shared and told him to lie down and rest, insisting that prolonging the agony would only make things worse. Issei, jaw clenched against the pain, made a final, weak request, though it could not be granted. Yuma looked at him with sorrowful eyes as he began to collapse. He fell to the ground, and the light in his eyes faded. Yuma stood over him in silence, the loss heavy in the air. It was already frustrating to think about what awaited him in the afterlife. Yuma Amano murmured, with a faint blush despite the situation, that dying in the arms of the person for whom someone had given their life carried a certain romantic quality, and she could at least grant Issei that comfort. The boy mumbled that his friends called him Se as his girlfriend drew closer. Yuma told him to have sweet dreams and rested her head gently against his chest, rocking him with quiet tenderness. Issei felt like his face rested against a firm, well-cushioned pillow. It was pleasant and peaceful. Perhaps this was what heaven felt like. Yuma seemed to have wings now. They were black rather than white, but that was a minor detail. She folded them around them both. The feathers were soft like silk and gave off a comforting warmth. With his eyes closed, Issei could hear Yuma's heartbeat, and it soothed him. He lost track of time as he savored the feeling. Eventually his legs could no longer bear his weight and he collapsed. Yuma caught him gently and laid him down on the ground. Yuma said in a soft, resigned voice that it was over and that it was time for him to rest. Issei, growing weaker, reached for her hand and said that, for her, he would be willing to come back from the dead. Yuma offered a sad little laugh and promised that she would always be there for him, then pressed his hand over her heart so he could feel her steady pulse. She said goodbye and rose into the air, leaving a few black feathers behind. Issei watched her go, feeling it increasingly difficult to move. He felt empty inside in a way that had nothing to do with the wound in his stomach. A coldness spread through him that was not the temperature but something within. Distracted with his last strength, he lifted the hand Yuma had held and noticed it trembling. He observed the color of something small and red and thought of a third-year upperclassman at Jusqu'au Academy whose hair had the same crimson shade. It was ironic that, having just left Yuma's embrace, his mind drifted to someone else, but his thoughts no longer followed their usual course. His final, fleeting thought was a small, familiar wish. Then his heart stopped and his hand fell limply to the cold ground of the park. A threatening voice from his dream had insisted that he wake up, warning of dire consequences if he did not. Issei turned off his alarm labeled Yandere and sat on the edge of his bed, dazed. His body felt heavy and stiff. Rubbing his temple distractingly, he tried to reconstruct the previous evening. Had it really happened? Of course not, he told himself. It must have been a dream. For one thing, he had woken up in his own. For another, if the events of the night before had been real, he would not have woken up at all. And finally, people with wings who conjured lances of light did not belong to the real world. He must have fallen asleep watching an anime and had a nightmare. That would explain why he felt off. To prove to himself that the events had not been real, he checked his phone contacts. As expected, there was no sign of Yuma, even though in his dream she had given him her number and email. Sighing lightly, he rose and searched for his uniform. He always left it on the back of his chair when he changed after coming home. The only times it was not there were when he had put it in the laundry, which he had not done. Frowning, Hyoudou Issei tried to remember where he had left it, but he could not place it. All he could recall was the dream in which his uniform had been pierced by a lance of light and stained because of his bleeding. But that had been a dream, so why could he not find the uniform? It was frustrating. He opened the shutters and immediately recoiled as if burned. Carefully, he reached a hand into the sunlight and withdrew it at once. He tried several times and confirmed his first impression. For some reason, daylight sapped his strength. It felt as if a heavy blanket slowed his movements and weighed him down. It was unsettling. What was happening to him? From downstairs, his mother called up in a surprised, slightly worried tone that he still had not come down yet. It was past 7. Normally he would already have completed his morning exercises and some martial arts katas. That routine had been in place for years and he had never missed a day except when ill. It made sense that his mother would worry if he had not left his room. Issei answered that he was up, concealing the unease in his voice, and added that he could not remember where he had put his uniform. His mother laughed gently and told him that he could be so absent-minded, and that the uniform was downstairs. She had found it in the living room, folded it, and placed it on the couch. He thanked his mother, frowning. He never took his uniform off outside his room unless he was in the house. Part of the rituals he used to keep his troublesome impulses in check. The more habitual his actions, the easier it was for him to ignore those impulses. Anything new or disruptive tended to work against him. So why was the uniform downstairs? Pulling on a robe, he left his room and descended the stairs. His house was fairly spacious. A ground floor with a living room and kitchen, an upper floor with a bathroom and 4 bedrooms including his and his parents', a terrace, and a basement cellar that he had set up as a small personal gym because no one else used it. He retrieved the uniform from the couch and returned to his room to inspect it carefully for any anomaly. He found one quickly. He always wrote his Romanized initials on the tags of his clothes, including the uniform, an old habit and another of his routines. So why were the initials missing from this uniform? Something strange was happening. He could not say what, but he felt it. Without any clear clue, there was little he could do immediately. Checking the time, he realized he still had about half an hour for his morning exercise, which, given all the disturbances since he had woken, he badly needed to clear his head. He changed into training gear and went to the basement, immediately feeling better. There was no natural light in the cellar, so he was no longer affected by the sun. That, at least, was a relief. He started with the rowing machine as a warm-up to engage most of his muscles and began to pull. He froze suddenly. Thanks to his training in several martial arts, karate, judo, Krav Maga, Jeet Kune Do, and more, he had a precise awareness of his body and limits. He knew that he had used exactly 23% of his strength in that first slide, yet the force behind it felt much greater than it should have. The machine itself reacted with more noise than it ought to have for the energy he had exerted. For some reason, his body was stronger than the day before. That was not normal. For a given effort, the result was several times what it should have been. In the sudden silence, Issei realized another fact that had previously escaped him. He could hear his parents downstairs. It was not particularly strange in itself. It happened often enough, but usually he could not make out their words because of the distance and the television in the living room. Today, however, they sounded as if they were right next to him. A cold sweat ran through Issei's body and he shivered. The longer the day went on, the less comfortable he felt. Despite the lack of energy he felt, he continued his morning exercises out of habit. Once finished, he took a shower, put on his school uniform, and went downstairs for breakfast. He grabbed his school bag and prepared to leave, then noticed his shoes were not in their usual place. They were on the landing at least, but on the right side instead of the left where he always put them as a left-hander. There was no mistaking it. His parents never touched his things. Rubbing his temple to stave off the beginnings of a headache, Issei took a deep breath before stepping outside and was hit by the weakness that seemed to follow his exposure to sunlight. From that, he suspected he might be stronger at night. He felt scared but not entirely surprised. A glance at his watch told him he would arrive a little early for class, which at least was something normal in his life, never too early, never late. When he reached Jusqu'au Academy, he went straight to his classroom. On the way, he overheard 2 classmates, Matsuda and Motohama, complaining about their inability to find girlfriends. Issei did not have much respect for them despite some superficial similarities. Matsuda and Motohama were known around school for their antics, and their loud complaints were familiar. Issei respected their honesty about themselves, but he was disgusted by how shamelessly they behaved. They had chosen their path and felt no remorse beyond their frustration at not finding partners. Issei, by contrast, had not chosen his troubles and had to bear their burden. That did not mean he was without flaws. He considered himself flawed and worked to keep his impulses under control. That was why he disliked Matsuda and Motohama so much. The bell rang and classes began. Although he was a diligent student and ranked 9th at Jusqu'au Academy, he found it especially hard to concentrate that day. The sunlight that made him lethargic contributed to his distraction, but it was not the only cause. Since the previous day, many things had failed to add up, and the only thing that might explain them was the dream he had had, absurd and surreal though it was. Issei found himself wondering if it could possibly be true. Lost in thought, he did not notice time passing. For most of the lessons he acted like an automaton, answering questions and copying notes while his mind wandered. He was surprised when the day was over. He owed that to his ingrained habits, otherwise he might not have noticed until much later. As it was, Issei had an activity planned of sorts. It was not a club activity. He did not belong to any club and felt no need to. Still, this next thing mattered to him. He had been given permission to attend the kendo club's practice as an observer. Looking back, he was not entirely sure how that arrangement had been made. He had a vague memory of facing the kendo club president, Murayama, in a match and winning, though part of that memory was hazy because Matsuda had accidentally tripped him on the stairs earlier that day, causing him to land against Murayama. That detail now made the sequence of events make more sense. The following week he had been challenged by Yura Tsubasa, a member of the student council who had heard of his match with the kendo club president and wanted to test him in a hand-to-hand contest without weapons. Thanks to a kind of instinct honed by his own martial arts practice, Issei had been able to sense that she was also a skilled, unarmed fighter. He managed to win, though he felt she had not taken him completely seriously and had not given her full effort. He still remembered the surprised look on her face when she found herself staring up at the ceiling and could not immediately explain how she had ended up on her back. Since that defeat, Tsubasa had treated Issei like a friend. She was, in fact, the only person he could really call a friend besides Irina, who lived in England. They still exchanged emails, but it was not the same. Between the time difference and their conflicting schedules, they could not call each other either. As a result, Yura remained the only person at school with whom he truly interacted. Yura had learned of his private struggles and, in coordination with the kendo club, arranged an understanding that allowed him to be present under strict conditions and boundaries. Curious and unsettled, he had gone to the club one evening to confirm the arrangement in person. When the members, including Murayama as president and Keitase as vice president, all affirmed the agreement with slight embarrassment, he bowed politely and thanked them for their cooperation. He promised to respect their privacy by attending only at a set time so as not to disturb anyone. The gesture earned a mixture of laughter and teasing from the club, and a nickname soon followed. The nickname spread around Kuo Academy in a strange, oddly affectionate way. While some troublemakers like Matsuda and Motohama had a reputation for thoughtless antics, Issei's reputation suggested he at least tried to be considerate and follow rules. Because of that, many of the female students tolerated him better than they did the others, and he became one of the more popular boys at the school, second only to Kiba Yudo. Matsuda and Motohama, unable to decide whether to resent or admire him, kept their distance after Issei made that choice for them. One afternoon, as Issei walked toward the back of the kendo club, he found Matsuda and Motohama already waiting with obvious mischief in mind. Without a word, Issei moved forward, grabbed each of them by the head, and slammed them against the wooden wall with a sharp, comical impact. The noise drew the kendoka out of the dojo, who promptly moved to apprehend the troublemakers. Murayama expressed relief that Issei had intervened and dismissed the two boys as troublesome individuals. Issei explained calmly that he had only confronted them for being in the area outside the agreed times. Murayama tapped her shurnai with a dangerous glint in her eye and said that the club would take care of things themselves. The next few minutes were humiliating for Matsuda and Motohama as the club administered a strict, non-violent reprimand. Issei felt no pity. They had behaved badly and suffered the consequences. The same pattern seemed to repeat every day, to Issei's quiet frustration. When the club had finished, Keitase, still slightly flushed from the commotion, asked if the practice session would start soon. Issei checked his watch and stated precisely that there were 2 minutes and 37 seconds remaining. Murayama raised an amused eyebrow at his punctuality. Issei explained that keeping to a strict schedule was how he distinguished himself from ordinary troublemakers like Matsuda and Motohama, and the girls laughed. Murayama wondered aloud why he persisted in remaining outside instead of entering when he had permission to do so. Issei replied that his presence inside would make them self-conscious and alter their behavior, so he chose to stay unobtrusive at a distance to preserve natural practice. Keitase admired the thoughtfulness of his answer. The girls blushed and entered the dojo to prepare for practice, aware that someone might be nearby. But trusting the boundaries that had been set, Issei smiled and waited until the appointed time before beginning to observe the training session. The reason he maintained this rigid routine was simple. He struggled with a chronic personal problem that he was trying to manage. He had learned to contain it by imposing strict limits on himself, treating those limits like a form of self-discipline that allowed him to behave normally until the next difficult PRD. What had started as harmless coping methods had, over time, stopped being enough, and he had to adjust his approach to keep himself and those around him safe. Issei had grown desperate for a solution when Tsubasa presented her miracle idea. He wondered if it was really a coincidence. For a long time he had been fighting with himself, and now something in him felt different. The overwhelming compulsion that had driven many of his worst impulses seemed to have faded. He allowed himself to hope, but cautiously. It might be temporary, and he did not want false optimism. For the moment, freed from that pressure, he decided to use the time to investigate one thing above all, whether Yuma had been real or only a dream. After what he had experienced, he was ready to believe almost anything. Issei went to the park where he had last seen his girlfriend and where, in his dream, he had died. He needed to understand what had happened between that moment and waking in his own bed. He told himself he hoped he was not some sort of walking corpse. That would be a very bad look. Night was falling as he arrived, and he confirmed a thought he had had that morning. His powers seemed weaker by day but stronger at night. His hearing reached farther, and his night vision was at least as good as his daytime sight. He noted this without pleasure. It was not the time to dwell on oddities. He had come to investigate. At the exact spot where he had died there was no visible blood, but when he crouched and sniffed the ground he caught a faint metallic scent. Even with his sharpened senses, it was surprisingly subtle. Apparently, it was not only his hearing and sight that had been enhanced. His sense of smell had too, and perhaps taste and touch as well, though he could not be certain yet. One conclusion stood out. It had not been a dream. He had really died there. He approached the fountain and rested a hand on its edge, letting his memories of the afternoon with Yuma come back. He felt no regret. The moment of nostalgia was abruptly cut short when a chill ran down his spine. Danger was approaching. He could not say what, but his instincts yelled that he might die again. When he turned cautiously, a man in a gray suit was walking toward him. The newcomer remarked that he had found an unlucky person and that it must be his lucky day to meet someone like Issei here. The man's tone carried a predatory amusement, and a murderous intent unfelt by Issei before washed over him. Sweat appeared on Issei's face, and he took an instinctive step back. He knew running would be pointless. The man would pursue and kill him. He had to stand and fight. The man stopped a few meters away and studied the surroundings indifferently. He said he did not sense a master or ally nearby and warned Issei not to try to escape or use a magic circle. After analyzing the situation, he concluded that Issei was a wanderer and that there would be no problem if he killed him. A spear of bluish-white light appeared in the man's hand, and with it Issei's lingering doubts about Yuma vanished. This man was like the others. He had encountered an angel with black wings and, to confirm it, 2 dark wings unfurled from the newcomer's back, making his presence more threatening. He readied himself to throw the javelin. When the man launched the spear, Issei barely evaded it and even managed to catch it. The moment his palm touched the weapon, it burned him sharply. He understood. Light itself harmed him. Just as sunlight had weakened him, the concentrated light of this spear injured him more intensely. The damage was visible and unmistakable. The attacker mocked him, saying the light was a deadly poison for beings of Issei's kind and that he had expected it to be enough to exterminate him. Issei shook his burned hand and dismissed the taunt inwardly, resolving not to give up. The man formed another spear, but Issei was ready. He leapt forward, grabbed his opponent's wrist, twisted it, and forced him to drop the weapon. He then struck decisively at the midsection. Against an ordinary opponent, such a move would have been enough to finish the fight, leaving them doubled over and struggling for breath. Unfortunately, this individual was not an ordinary person, and he stumbled back a few steps with a slight grimace. Without giving him time to recover, Issei used his shoe to angle the spear on the ground toward his enemy and then struck its tip with a powerful kick. Even without full contact, he felt the weapon's harmful heat against his toes, but there was no lasting injury. The man, surprised, made the javelin vanish, which made Issei swallow a frustrated sound. He took in the lesson. The man could make weapons appear and disappear with a gesture, seemingly able to create them only from his hands while destroying them regardless of location. At least he was vulnerable to his own light, Otherwise he would not have dispelled the weapon aimed at him. Issei leaped at his opponent again, and the man let out an irritated growl. Issei used his elbow to open the man's guard and then landed several precise punches to the same spot on the chest, the area of the solar plexus where his first strike had fallen. By concentrating his attacks, Issei forced damage to accumulate in one place. The man's grimace deepened. He had felt those hits. In close quarters, Issei seemed to have the advantage over the opponent, who fought awkwardly. Clearly a ranged fighter, the man was not about to get the chance to exploit that. Ducked under an overly wide hook, moved beneath the man's arm, and struck the back of his knees. The enemy faltered and dropped to his knees. Seizing the golden opportunity, Issei put himself in position and, before his opponent could react, delivered a hard kick to the man's face that sent him flying into the distance and slamming into a tree. Panting slightly, Issei approached the fallen adversary, who showed no sign of moving and was clearly neutralized. Cautiously, the boy looked up at the sky, which remained strangely altered. Instinct told him that, as long as it stayed that way, he could not leave the park. How to restore it to normal? The man facing him had caused the distortion and could likely reverse it, but he would never agree to do so. He intended to kill him, after all. The question remained what to do next. Lost in thought, Issei did not see the next attack. Instinctively he moved, but could not fully dodge the spear, which cut across his abdomen. The wound was not fatal, but it caused sharp pain and bled noticeably. Because of the spear's light attribute, the cut burned intensely. Grunting, he gritted his teeth and pressed a hand against the injury to slow the bleeding. The man made a dismissive sound as he straightened, head held high, with a thin trickle of blood at his lip but otherwise unhurt. He declared that he had been humiliated by a mere stray and vowed to kill Issei to wash away the insult, adding that he would inflict some torment first. Issei scolded himself for his inattention. This being was clearly not human. Attacks designed to stop humans would not be fully effective against him. Still, the man had managed to wound him, and the repeated blows to the solar plexus must have been painful even for such a creature. The enemy formed another spear of light in his hand and readied it to throw. Issei prepared to dodge. His injury, though painful, was not crippling. Just as the man launched the javelin, a black beam edged with a faint crimson aura struck it and destroyed the weapon effortlessly. The man asked, perplexed, whether Issei had done that, but then a red glow appeared at the edge of his vision. A familiar voice ordered the man not to touch the boy. Issei noted the red hair and, while keeping his attention on his opponent, asked whether it was Rias. The man demanded to know who this newcomer was and formed another spear of light. He threw the javelin toward the newcomer, but the weapon was easily deflected by a third person who had leapt down from a nearby tree. Issei recognized Kaneko Tuju even from the corner of his eye. Even in the worst situations, surprises could still come. The man shouted a vulgar insult as he charged toward them. His attack was intercepted once more, this time by lightning that struck from the sky and slammed into the ground, the explosion's blast throwing the man several meters back. The one responsible stepped forward, electricity still crackling in her hand as it faded. Kino. Himejima stood there with a warm smile, and Issei watched without surprise as the scene unfolded. The man muttered at the sight of red hair and concluded that the newcomer must be from the Gremory family. Rias announced that she was Rias Gremory and introduced herself to the fallen angel. The man chuckled, dusted off the hat that had fallen during the lightning blast, and put it back on. He expressed mock surprise that the city belonged to the future head of the Gremory family and asked whether the boy was one of her servants. Rias responded that she would be merciless if anyone harmed him, and the man offered a hollow apology for the day's events while wiping the trickle of blood from his face. He warned them not to let their servants run free. The winged man suggested that someone like him might well hunt them on occasion during a stroll. Issei thought with irony that the man would have been defeated if Issei had not become distracted at the end of their clash, a slight grimace of pain crossing his face. Rias expressed her gratitude for the man's advice in the same calm tone the fallen angel had used earlier, then warned that next time she intended to make him be quiet. The man replied provocatively, took flight, gave his name as Don Hasik, and said he hoped they would never have to meet again. He then disappeared into the night sky. Rias watched the heavens for a few more seconds before turning to Issei with a smile, clearly relieved to see him alive. Rias greeted him with a soft voice and introduced herself. Issei tried to answer, but a wave of dizziness swept over him as the adrenaline faded. He realized he had underestimated the seriousness of his wound. It was not fatal, but it had been poisoned. He sank to his knees and vaguely registered Rias's worried tone before blacking out, hoping it would not become a habit to lose consciousness after fights with black-winged foes. His alarm repeatedly called for him to wake up. Issei, groggy, slapped it off and emerged from the covers, feeling the strain of his body protesting every movement. The sunlight through the half-closed blinds was harsh on his newly heightened sensitivity, and he hoped he would quickly adapt. He sat on the edge of his bed and tried to make sense of the previous day, his memories hazy at first but then snapping back into place. He recalled his encounter with his girlfriend, who had turned out to be an angel with black wings and who had been forced to kill him. The next day all traces of her had vanished, and Issei had experienced sudden, drastic changes, increased physical strength and sharpened senses. His investigation at the park had led to a confrontation with a man who also possessed black wings. A moment of distraction during that fight had nearly cost him his life and left him badly injured. A woman with crimson hair had arrived afterward to tend to him, and those details returned to him now without the previous blurriness. His attention shifted to a pile of neatly folded clothing beside his bed. Among the garments were pieces of the female uniform of Jusqu'au Academy. From that evidence, Issei concluded who had been in his room. He steadied himself against the mixture of confusion and concern the discovery brought, finding himself oddly calm despite the strange circumstances. A soft voice came from the bed. The person there awoke and revealed herself to be Rias Gremory. The situation was unexpected, but there was no scandalous intimacy to interpret, only the reality of allies brought together by recent, violent events. They shared a tense, meaningful look as the implications settled between them. As expected, it was a young woman of about 17 with crimson hair, an ahogue standing out against strands so long they nearly reached her thighs while she sat, and a loose fringe framing her face. Her eyes were a striking blue-green, almost turquoise, and her skin was very fair. Her name was Rias Gremory. A brief neutral note was inserted in place of certain personal details that are not relevant to the present scene. Rias greeted him with a gentle smile, clearly unbothered by the circumstances, and Issei Hyoudou returned the gesture with a slight bow of the head as he introduced himself. He did not attempt to hide his posture. He was as composed as she appeared to be despite the shock of the previous events. Rias asked if it was necessary to be so formal, and Issei admitted that formality was not strictly required. He explained, however, that given the current situation he preferred not to be too familiar with someone in his bed until he knew why she was there. Rias found the reasoning admirable but unnecessary, and she observed that he did not seem particularly surprised by her presence. Issei replied that after the day he had experienced yesterday, nothing could astonish him. He made a small grimace as he touched the spot where a beam of light had struck him the day before, an injury that still tinged his memory. Rias confessed that she was the one who was surprised. She had expected him to think the events of the last 2 days were dreams. Issei acknowledged that was his initial thought. He admitted he was not especially skeptical by nature, but without proof he had assumed the experiences were a dream. Then he said he had noticed inconsistencies that did not fit his prior understanding of the world. When Rias tilted her head in curiosity, he elaborated. He had found many small things that made no sense because they should not have been. For example, his school uniform was not where he always kept it, and when he examined it further he realized it was not even his real uniform but a substitute. That could have been a coincidence, Rias suggested, amused by the conversation, and Issei agreed that it could, which was why he had not relied on only that single detail. He continued, describing a newfound sensitivity to sunlight that made his body react strongly, almost as if allergic. He said the change was subtle, and would have gone unnoticed if he had not been so familiar with his own body. This led to the next point. He had discovered a significant increase in his physical abilities, though it seemed to vary with time. He felt stronger in the shadows and at night, and comparatively weaker during the day. His senses were affected in a similar way. Rias told him that she would explain more later when they had more time. Issei declared that he had suspected she was involved. He paused, then mentioned another odd detail. His shoes had been placed on the right side of the landing even though he was left-footed. That might have been his parents, he allowed, but he was the only one who usually handled them. Rias noticed that he had stopped mid-thought and asked if there was something else. Issei answered that he preferred not to speak about it until he knew what had happened to him. Rias accepted that. Issei then became serious and demanded to know why she was there. He clarified that it was not that he did not appreciate waking up as he had, he really did appreciate it. What he disliked was not knowing something of such importance. Rias reminded him that he had been injured the day before as she examined his chest with obvious interest and explained that she had healed him. Issei asked how she had done it and ran a hand over the smooth skin where the wound had been, puzzled but impressed. Rias introduced herself properly as Rias Gremory and stated that she was a demon. Issei mentally noted the irony of having assumed she was an incarnation of sin. Rias added that she was now his master and said she would explain what that meant later. She then clarified that she had used her magic through the night to heal him. Issei flinched out of habit. Years of wariness in awkward situations made him tense, especially when those moments involved him. He felt relieved that he had not been compelled by old impulses, but the strength of his reactions left him increasingly suspicious. Rias admitted she had not expected that reaction. Issei apologized and said his response had nothing to do with her, he was simply cautious because of things he would explain once she had told him everything he needed to know. Rias accepted that and said she would go over the complex details later, promising to fill him in that evening. She reminded him that time was limited for a full explanation now. Issei agreed that sounded reasonable. Issei then asked one more question for confirmation, looking Rias in the eye. He wanted to know if she had really saved his life 2 nights ago. Rias smiled and explained that, while the full explanation was part of the complex information she would give later, the short version was that if he was alive now it was thanks to her. She also mentioned that she had provided him a new uniform after the old one was destroyed and had tidied up his shoes. Issei expressed sincere thanks, and Rias replied that the pleasure had been hers. She rose gracefully and began dressing, unfazed by doing so in his presence. She inspected his body with a professional eye as she put on her clothes. Rias confessed she had been surprised and impressed by how quickly his body recovered when she healed him during the night. He had recovered from a serious injury in just a few hours, and even with her magic that was remarkable. She wondered aloud how he had developed such strong, resilient muscles. Issei attributed it mostly to physical conditioning, not wanting to elaborate. Rias murmured that he must have pushed himself to his limit and beyond to build such a powerful physique. Issei realized then that Rias knew someone who had done something similar and made the connection aloud. Rias confirmed briefly that it was a cousin. Rias turned away after finishing dressing and asked Issei for a small favor. Issei's hand moved on its own toward Rias, but he stopped himself and apologized, saying he could not comply. Rias turned to look at him, saw his expression of hesitation and discomfort, and understood. She took care of the task herself. Rias then asked if she could call him Issei. Issei brightened and agreed, explaining that his friends called him Issei. Rias accepted Issei as a nickname for private use and said that in public she preferred to be addressed as club president. Issei asked why she wanted that title. Rias said he would understand after classes that evening and gave an amused look before returning to dressing. Issei suddenly realized he was still without clothes and blushed before remembering. He asked if the spare uniform Rias had given him had been ruined in the fight the previous night. Rias reassured him that she had brought another set and pointed to a dresser where clean clothes lay neatly folded. Issei thanked her sincerely, took the clothes, and began dressing without worrying about doing so in front of Rias, since she had already been comfortable changing earlier. Once dressed, Issei asked why Rias had slept in his room instead of returning home after healing him. Rias explained that because of the poisonous nature of his wound, she had to use a great deal of magic to heal him, which had left her exhausted. She had fallen asleep as soon as his wound was gone. Issei apologized for making her tired, But Rias said not to worry and admitted that she had been partly at fault for the second attack because she had not been cautious enough. Issei recalled the attacker introducing himself as Don Hasik and remembered that the light-based weapon had hurt far more than the one from Yuma. He also remembered the attacker saying that light was harmful to beings of his kind, and that since Yuma had left him for dead in the park he had become more sensitive to light. Now, with Rias claiming to have saved him and declaring herself his master, Issei let the thought sit unresolved for the moment. They decided it was best to go downstairs for breakfast. Issei worried that introducing Rias to his parents would be interesting. He imagined his parents might be quick to consider marriage given Rias's courage in staying with him through the night. He sighed, realizing that with everything that had happened that morning he had once again missed his morning exercises. Rias announced that she would enjoy the meal and drank a bowl of miso soup, telling Mrs. Hyoudou that it was delicious. Mrs. Hyoudou stammered her thanks, clearly flustered. Rias found amusement in the reactions of both the woman and her husband and allowed the strange, pleasant atmosphere in the kitchen to unfold. After all, she was still a demon. Beside her, Issei paid no attention to his parents' behavior and quietly ate his own food. Mr. Hyoudou called out to Issei in a trembling voice and asked who the young woman was. Rias realized she had forgotten to introduce herself and apologized inwardly. She introduced herself as Rias Gremery and explained that she attended the same school as Issei. She then directed a calm, steady look at Mr. Hyoudou and quietly channeled a small amount of demonic magic to ease his doubts. His eyes became slightly glassy, a detail unnoticed by the others. Rias had made sure to be discreet. Mr. Hyoudou asked if she was from another country and complimented her Japanese. Rias confirmed that she had lived in Japan for several years. The father listened, sounding relieved. Seeing that he had been placated, Rias suppressed a smile. She only wanted Issei's parents not to question her presence. The mother, however, still looked tense. She seemed worried for her son in a way Rias could not immediately understand. Mrs. Hyoudou asked cautiously what kind of relationship Rias had with Issei, her gaze flicking between her son and their guest. Rias explained that they were an upperclassman and a lowerclassman who had grown close. Mrs. Hyoudou hesitated and then asked whether Issei had asked a woman for help with his problems. Issei immediately cut in with a warning tone, insisting that nothing improper had happened. Rias confirmed that Issei had been having nightmares, and she had simply stayed overnight to comfort him. Rias sensed that there was a deeper worry in the mother's expression, something specific that concerned her about her son, but she could not determine its exact nature. To smooth things over, Rias calmly used a small touch of magic to ease Mrs. Hyoudou's fears as she had with her husband. The mother's tension melted, her posture relaxing as she accepted Rias's explanation that staying overnight had been to provide comfort. Issei, frustrated, passed a hand in front of his mother's face, but she remained unresponsive, still somewhat detached. He clicked his fingers a few times to no effect, then, with a wry smile, performed a mock Jedi gesture and made a playful remark that referenced a movie line. Mrs. Hyoudou repeated the line obediently, prompting a sigh from Issei and a light laugh from Rias at his amusement. Issei admitted he had always wanted to do that, then quickly sobered and demanded an explanation for Rias's actions. Rias apologized and said she had used her magic because she felt the conversation was becoming awkward and she wanted to resolve things quickly. Issei muttered that it would have been easier to avoid certain topics, but did not press further. Rias asked what Mrs. Hyoudou had wanted to discuss, and Issei deflected, changing the subject and asking how long his parents would remain in that state. Rias reassured him that it would not be long, just a few minutes at most, since their minds only needed a short time to adjust to the normalcy of her presence in his life. Issei summarized that she had hypnotized them, and Rias admitted, without shame, that she had used her magic just a little. Rias reassured him that there would be no side effects beyond having to accept her presence and that of those connected to her without question. Issei looked at her for a few seconds in silence, then stood and urged that they hurry or they would be late for school. Rias watched him leave with a slight confusion. For some reason, Hyoudou had clearly been against her use of hypnosis. He had not openly protested, but his behavior had made his disapproval obvious. Rias wondered if he had had a bad experience with it. She knew she had used one of the magical forms of hypnosis, while other, non-magical forms existed as well. It was not the time to dwell on it, though, because it was time to go to Jusqu'au Academy. On the way, Issei confirmed why some called him the holy pervert. Despite his reputation, he was attentive to the women around him. He humbly offered to carry Rias's bag and made sure throughout the walk that she was comfortable. Rias frowned slightly. She had heard that Issei's reputation for lechery was legendary, yet he had been remarkably restrained all morning. She set the oddity aside and focused on the morning. Students reacted loudly as they arrived at Jusqu'au Academy. A girl squealed at the sight of Rias going to school with the so-called holy pervert. Another student called it an incredible sight. Several boys shouted their outrage with exaggerated emotion. Rias was not surprised by the attention. She was admired by many students, and Issei, despite his nickname, had earned a surprising amount of respect from the girls. That admiration made him a target of resentment among the boys, who disliked him more than even Hyoudou, the usual rival for attention. Rias told Issei that a messenger would come for her later, and Issei bowed slightly and said he would see her after school before going his own way. She smiled faintly, ignored the stairs, and headed for her classroom on the first floor. At the top of the stairs she paused when she saw someone she considered a friend despite their constant rivalry. The woman was Sona Citri, roughly Rias's age, wearing glasses and with amethyst eyes. Sona was slender, with black hair that reached the middle of her neck. She was shorter than Rias and less developed in the chest, but she carried a strict, composed beauty that had made her the third most popular girl at the school. Sona greeted Rias from where she leaned against a column near the first-floor railing, and Rias returned the greeting as she approached. Sona, who preferred to be called Sona at Jusqu'au Academy, was strict but fair and very intelligent. She served as president of the student council, while Rias was president of the occult research club. These positions meant more than titles. They came with responsibilities and privileges that shaped how each of them interacted with the school. Sona asked if the person Rias had with her was her new member, and Rias confirmed with a touch of fondness in her tone. Sona, momentarily softer than her usual strictness, remarked that taking someone on a whim was unlike Rias. Rias laughed and said she supposed she now had a cute little brother. Sona's expression turned serious as she warned that Issei had a very complex and difficult personality to handle, especially for a young woman. Rias asked what she meant, and Sona responded that Rias did not seem to be aware. Sona explained that Issei had a particular condition and that, as student council president, she had access to student files, academic and medical records that ordinary students could not see. She added that she was strict about not abusing that privilege. Rias absorbed this information thoughtfully. The club president suggested that this must be what Issei had meant when he said he would speak once he knew everything there was to know about demons, and she added that his mother had mentioned something similar to the class president's words, but Issei had stopped her from speaking. The class president said she was not surprised, nodding in understanding, and noted that Hyoudu's situation was truly unusual. Even among demons his case was remarkable, and now he was one of them. The club president fell silent, looked over the railing where the boy had stood earlier, and wondered what mystery surrounded I. The day passed slowly for Issei. The classes had seemed monotonous, but at least he had been able to follow them reasonably well, which was progress compared to the day before. He had even made the strange discovery during English class that he could speak perfect other languages, even though he had been struggling with Japanese a few days earlier. He had only tested with English, but he suspected the ability applied to other languages as well. A girl in his class screamed in surprise, and another student, with hearts in her eyes, called out the name Hyoudou. Distracted, Issei looked at the newcomer. Hyoudou was a handsome young man with short blonde hair, gray eyes, and a small beauty mark beneath his left eye. Issei had never spoken to him before, although Hyoudou was even more popular than he was. Now Hyoudou was approaching him. Hyoudou smiled and greeted him. Issei asked skeptically if he could help. Hyoudou explained that he had a message from Rias Gremery, and then asked if Issei would accompany him for a moment. Issei rose, picked up his bag and agreed to follow. Other girls nearby squealed and teased excitedly about the pair as they left, and Kiba's smile tightened slightly as they exited the classroom. Kiba led Issei out of the main building and into the old Crow Academy Annex, a building that was supposed to be off-limits because of its age. Without speaking, Kiba entered and guided Issei toward one of the old classrooms. When the door opened, Issei felt as if he had stepped into a different world. The room had paneled walls and several Victorian-style sofas and armchairs along the sides. A large pentagram was painted on the floor, and the lighting soft and supernatural came from many candles on candelabras. On one of the sofas sat a young girl Issei recognized from the park the night before, Tuju Kaneko. She was a student of about 15 with white hair falling to her shoulders, a black cat-shaped hair clip, and large hazel eyes. Her expression was neutral as she ate sweets, but she turned her head when the newcomers entered. The two of them held each other's gaze for a moment. Kaneko blushed slightly, Issei returned the smile, and she looked away. Issei chuckled. Kiba, uncertain, remarked that he thought he had just seen something extraordinary. Kaneko, staring at the blonde with steady intensity, suggested that Kiba must have been dreaming. Kiba accepted that possibility with an embarrassed laugh and a bead of sweat. Issei's attention drifted to one corner of the room where an oddly placed shower area had been set up. He paused, wondering why such a thing stood there. A female voice announced that the club president had an unexpected guest. Akino Himejima stepped forward. She was a few years older and carried herself with a graceful, traditional presence. Her long black hair was tied back with a ribbon into a single ponytail that reached near her knees. She had been present the previous night when Rias had saved Issei. Issei noted the familiarity and that she served as the club's vice president. Rias responded with thanks to Akino, and Issei noticed the club president's silhouette behind a curtain. Kaneko, seeing Issei still looking around, muttered that he was the worst in a dry tone. Issei turned back to her and held her gaze until she averted her eyes again. She mumbled a brief apology, cheeks faintly reddening, and Issei reassured her that it was fine. He explained that he only observed people when he had been given permission to do so, permission that had been granted by the club president. Kaneko returned to eating, still a little flushed. Akino approached the group and introduced herself as the club's vice president, bowing politely and welcoming Issei to enjoy his time with them. Rias then stepped out from behind the curtain and apologized for the wait, explaining that Issei's house had no shower. The boy waved a hand dismissively and insisted it was not a problem, saying he had witnessed something extraordinary. Rias Gremory smiled and set down the towel. Everyone settled in. Issei sat on a couch to the right of Kaneko, who avoided looking at him though her blush was nearly faded. Across from him, Hyoudou sat on a couch to the left of Akino. Rias perched on a dresser to Issei's left with her arms crossed. Rias formally welcomed him and explained that the Occult Research Club honored his presence, though the club itself was merely a front and a hobby. Issei guessed it was because she was a demon. Rias corrected him, pointing out that they were all demons. Issei considered this quietly. Rias continued that the man with black wings from the previous day had been a fallen angel, once an angel in service to God. Issei suddenly rubbed his head and grimaced as a migraine struck. He noticed that the others had also winced, confirming it was not just him. Rias apologized and explained that demons could not pronounce the names of deities who saw demons as evil without feeling pain. Demons were uncomfortable near holy places and vulnerable to sacred objects such as the cross, holy water, and the Bible. Even simple contact could harm them. Light weakened them as well, including sunlight, though over time a demon could develop minor resistance proportional to their power. Issei processed this information and realized he truly was a demon. Rias observed that he did not seem surprised and credited his sharp observational skills. Issei hesitated, then expressed concern that as a demon he might not be able to pray. Rias admitted she had not known he was religious but confirmed that a demon could not pray without experiencing great pain. Issei insisted he needed to pray at least one last time before fully accepting his new existence. Rias offered him the chance to pray there, explaining that the act of prayer would affect only the demon performing it. Issei thanked her, brought his hands together, and bowed his head. He apologized and spoke as if addressing a personal guardian, thanking that presence for everything it had done, for giving him courage and will when he thought he could no longer bear on, and promising never to forget that generosity. He concluded by invoking a deity he had invented for himself. The members of the Occult Research Club, who had listened intently to Issei's final words, were stunned by the unconventional ending to his prayer. They were at a loss for words. It had made no sense to them. Issei blinked in surprise at feeling no pain. Rias hesitated and then asked who this deity was. Issei, embarrassed, admitted it was a deity he had made up. Rias repeated the name incredulously and asked what mythology it belonged to. Issei explained there was none. He had invented it himself. The narration noted that humans long invented religions to feel secure and justify their actions. Issei had been unable to adopt any existing faith because his unusual fixation did not fit them, so he had created a deity that could understand and accept those feelings without judgment. In his imagination, that deity was served by a spirit capable of granting wishes. Aquino laughed softly at the absurdity of the situation, while Rias dismissed it and steered the conversation back to the main topic. Rias explained that fallen angels lost divine grace because of impure thoughts. They were enemies of demons and sought to kill them, having been ordered to destroy demons. Pure angels had their own side as well, making the conflict a three-way struggle among angels, fallen angels, and demons. Issei concluded that Yuma and the man Don Hisik were fallen angels. Rias confirmed this and added that fallen angels, like demons, could hypnotize people. That explained how the woman posing as a Mono Yuma had been able to erase all traces of her existence after finishing her task. Issei murmured that she had killed him, and Rias expressed surprise that he had understood so much. She then explained that she had been able to bring him back to life by reincarnating him as a demon. Issei remembered Yuma mentioning something about a sacred artifact when she had killed him. Rias corrected the term to sacred gear and nodded, indicating it was likely the reason he had been killed. Rias explained that the power was granted by the leader of the angels to humans so they could stand on equal footing with supernatural beings like fallen angels and demons. Issei listened thoughtfully. Rias noted that since the fallen angel had killed him, she had discovered the presence of a sacred gear in him. Now that he had been reincarnated as a demon, she could sense it clearly. Rias instructed Issei to raise his left arm, close his eyes, and picture the strongest image he could recall. Issei obeyed. With his eyelids shut, he searched for the most vivid memory he could summon. There were several: the date with Yuma, the fight against Don Hisik, and the time spent with Irina, an older memory he treasured from before his personal problems. Eventually, however, another intense memory surfaced that made him react more strongly than the others. When Issei raised his left arm, it glowed with a green light and something materialized over it. A massive gauntlet appeared, predominantly red with yellow accents, adorned with a large green jewel on the back of the hand. The fingers remained uncovered, leaving them free. Above all, Issei felt a surge of power flow through him as the sacred gear manifested. Rias recognized the sacred gear and, with a hint of disappointment, identified it as twice critical, a relatively common sacred gear that multiplies its user's power. Issei studied his arm a moment, eyes narrowed, then asked what Rias meant by power. Rias blinked at the question, surprised, and admitted she could not fully define it. She repeated what was generally accepted: twice critical doubled its owner's power, but she had no deeper explanation. Issei requested any documents she had on twice critical and sacred gears. In general, so he could study them. Rias promised to lend the materials once their conversation was over, and Issei thanked her sincerely. Rias then explained the basics of demon society and said she would teach him the rest gradually to avoid overwhelming him. Issei understood what would come next. Rias told him it was his turn to explain his condition and why he appeared to be afraid of women despite admiring them. Before beginning his explanations, Issei furrowed his brow and deactivated twice critical, then asked one last question about how he had been reincarnated. Rias declined to explain for the moment and said she would tell him in a few days, advising that it would be better for him to get used to his newly acquired status as a demon before delving into the details. Issei agreed, slightly reluctant, and then grimaced as he announced that it was his turn to speak. He hoped everyone would listen carefully, since he did not intend to repeat the story, and he asked that they not judge him for what he was about to reveal. Rias assured him that no one would judge. She explained that every member of her peerage had a complicated past and that they would understand what he had gone through. Issei began his story. He said it had started when he was 7 and living a relatively normal, happy childhood with friends, including one who had been his best friend, Irina. Rias observed that Irina sounded like a feminine name for a boy, and the others listened attentively. Issei shrugged and said it did not matter. At the time Irina had been his neighbor and they played together every day, sharing a childhood dream of becoming heroes. The image of a small Issei declaring such a dream made the group smile inwardly. The notion fit what they knew of him, and Rias thought he must have been particularly endearing back then. Rias wondered aloud whether that childhood dream was the reason Issei had developed his current physique. Issei admitted it was not really the reason, though he acknowledged it would have been a plausible one and promised to explain later. He continued, everything was fine until Irina's family was forced to move abroad because of his father's work. Irina's father had been a Protestant priest and had been transferred to England. Rias immediately connected the name and asked whether the father might be Hyoudou Toji. When Issei asked how she knew, Rias explained that Hyoudou Toji had been responsible for the Kuo church and that his departure had allowed her family to claim the town as part of their domain. Without that circumstance, she would not have been permitted to study in the human world. Issei murmured that it made sense and noted that it had not occurred to him earlier. He realized it could complicate matters if he and Irina met again, but for now their communication by email would avoid immediate issues. He was surprised to learn that at least Irina's father appeared to be aware of the supernatural world. After Irina left, Issei said, he sank into a long PRD of sadness and often spent time alone in the park where they had played, regretting the loss of his friend. He described the next part of his past as a tragicomedy and then, with some discomfort, recalled meeting an older man in the park who told him stories that were inappropriate for a child. The exposure affected him. When his parents discovered what had happened, they reported the matter to the authorities. The man was arrested, and Issei was taken to see several psychologists so that professionals could ensure he had not suffered lasting harm from the experience. Rias inferred that the assessment had not been entirely reassuring, and Issei confirmed with a somber nod that the results had indeed been concerning. Issei explained that psychologists had concluded his psyche had been altered to the point that his fixation on BRSTS had become the center of his obsessions and his world. He said he could think only through that lens, completely and irrevocably. Rias concluded that he had been hypnotized, finally understanding why he had been so opposed to the use of hypnosis on his parents. She felt a little guilty for bringing up painful memories, yet was impressed that, despite everything, he had been able to meet discomfort with humor and even make a Star Wars reference. Issei's mental strength spoke volumes given how much his mind had been altered in childhood. Issei confirmed this and went on to say that the man who had manipulated him had planted a fixation so deep in his psyche that secondary effects emerged years later. When Rias asked how, Issei invoked the proverb that the body often follows what the mind believes and said that applied to his situation. Because of that, he experienced physical changes at a very young age that complicated his life. Hyoudou observed that it did not sound pleasant. Issei agreed and described how his immature mind could not make sense of powerful, confusing urges. He said those overwhelming impulses sometimes made him lose control of his own behavior, and that without his parents' vigilance there could have been terrible consequences in his youth. Kaneko listened with unusual attention. She thought the situation resembled a phenomenon among certain yokai species during their mating season, when the young sometimes lost self-control and caused dangerous incidents. Her own knowledge in that regard was personal and complicated, but she could tell from Issei's scent that he had been fully human before his reincarnation, with only the faintest trace of dragon lingering because of his sacred gear. For those reasons, she sincerely sympathized with how enduring and disruptive his condition had been. Issei recalled his psychologist's flippant remark about a second brain in his lower body and scoffed, but admitted the jest captured how little control he sometimes had. He compared it to a primitive evolutionary drive, a powerful biological urge, and said it had been so strong that he could not always master it. When Rias noted that he spoke of this in the past tense and asked whether it was no longer a problem, Issei shrugged and explained that the urge had only grown stronger with time, but he had learned to fight it and was no longer dominated by it, though it remained a constant struggle. When Kaneko asked how he had managed, Issei described relentless physical training. He had devoted himself to sports, especially martial arts, valuing their emphasis on inner peace. He trained and trained until he had no energy left to give in to those urges, continuing that regimen without pause for 5 years. Rias understood then how he had forged such a strong body. Issei acknowledged that desperate effort produced such results, but also admitted that even extreme training was only a partial solution. His need persisted and would have continued to grow unbearable without some relief. Akino, suppressing an ill-timed laugh, noted that this was the origin of Issei's reputation for lechery. Issei agreed and said he had fought fire with fire, finding ways to relieve his urges through media at first, then through gradually more intense material as time passed. That coping strategy, combined with his martial discipline, had allowed him to keep control for about 5 years. When Rias hesitated and asked whether he had ultimately given in, Issei admitted that he had come close, but that a friend had discovered part of his situation and, instead of reacting with disgust, had shown understanding and offered help. He said he only later realized how much he owed that friend. Hyoudou guessed that the friend in question was Yura Tsubasa. Rias Gremory raised an eyebrow. Issei Hyoudou tilted his head and asked if she knew the person in question. Rias replied evasively that she knew her in a way. She reflected that, just as Issei fell under the Gremory household's oversight, Yura Tsubasa had been reincarnated through Citri's intervention. In fact, the student council members had been reincarnated by Sona in the same manner that the members of the Occult Research Club had been reincarnated by Rias. For that reason, the student council president had been able to use Tsubasa as an intermediary to help manage Issei's situation. Sona had not done this lightly. She had to be sure Issei could be trusted, recruit discreet participants, protect their reputations, and craft a public narrative that would make the arrangement work. Citri had spent days and nights researching and shaping that persona for him. Rias found herself, reluctantly, admiring the effort even as she regretted not having been the one to find the solution for her cherished servant. With that context, Rias understood why Issei's mother had been so anxious and so adamant that her son avoid certain risky situations. Her concern had been literal and protective rather than malicious. Issei finished his explanation with a sigh of relief. Rias then interjected, concerned that he had implied each measure taken so far had been only temporary. She pointed out that his methods had escalated over time and asked whether the current arrangement might eventually prove insufficient to manage his condition. Issei admitted it was complicated. He explained that his enrollment at Jusqu'au Academy had not been a conscious choice at first, but that staying had become a calculated gamble. He could have chosen another school, yet he had remained at Jusqu'au despite knowing a large majority of the students were girls. There were practical reasons for that decision. Jusqu'au Academy's diploma had real international value, and he believed that if he could learn to control his condition in the most challenging environment, he might be able to control it anywhere. He had also hoped that continuing his studies would help him cope, but that particular plan had failed. Rias listened thoughtfully. Issei added that he had another motive for staying. He had hoped to find a partner who would understand his situation and help him manage it. The room grew quiet as everyone absorbed that admission. He went on to say that Yuma had been another gamble, someone who had wanted to be his girlfriend, but that, in the end, she had not been the right person. Akino offered support with a modest smile and a gentle assurance that she would gladly help him if needed. Issei hesitated and suggested it might not be necessary. Since his rebirth as a demon, he said, his body had not reacted the same way as before. The overwhelming impulses that had plagued him seemed to have diminished. He could not fully explain it, but he had first noticed the change during a visit to the kendo club, when he felt nothing beyond the ordinary excitement of a teenager. He remembered an earlier awkward encounter. Rias Gremory's eyes widened as she appeared to understand something. Issei Hyoudou hastened to say that he did not know whether it was temporary and preferred not to take any risks until he learned more. Rias reassured him and said she thought she knew exactly what had happened. Issei reacted with skeptical surprise. Rias explained that demons were beings tied to the 7 deadly sins: greed, wrath, envy, gluttony, lust, pride, and sloth, and that as demons they had a deep connection to those aspects. She said Issei's condition had been related to lust in a psychological way, and that when she reincarnated him as one of them, that particular problem had simply ceased to exist. Rias smiled with quiet triumph at the thought that she had resolved Issei's long-standing issue in a permanent way, even if it had been accidental. She reflected that it was rare for her to feel she had bested her rival, and she did not let the finer details of the circumstance distract her. Issei asked if she was sure, preferring not to get his hopes up. Rias admitted it was only a theory, but insisted it would explain everything. Issei accepted the explanation for the moment while remaining cautious. Rias then asked about the religion he'd mentioned, sensing the conversation would be awkward. Issei acknowledged it and asked what she wanted to know. Rias asked bluntly whether he had invented a religion. Issei confirmed that he had and asked whether that posed a problem now that he was a demon. Rias acknowledged that it was unusual for demons to take an active part in religious practice. Outside of their conflicts with angelic factions, demons usually did not involve themselves deeply in human religions, although a few eccentric individuals among them sometimes revered alternate deities. She said she was more curious about why he had created a religion rather than joined one. Issei explained that he had struggled with a personal compulsion that many religions would judge harshly, so he had created a faith that would accept him and help him bear the burden rather than condemn him. He had fashioned a deity named Shikigami to symbolize that dependence and to represent the focus of his devotion. Rias noted that there was surprising depth to his faith. Issei said he had spent 5 years shaping it from something small into a more concrete practice because he needed it. At the time he had not even known that gods might truly exist, and he hoped he had not angered any real divinity by inventing the tradition. Rias smiled and told him not to worry too much, saying that gods were usually understanding. She added enigmatically that gods must have arisen from something, which left Issei puzzled. When he pressed her for clarification, she only smiled and said he was not ready to hear more about it. He accepted her answer. Rias then asked if he intended to continue his devotions to Shikigami. Issei confirmed that he had invested time in making the belief meaningful to him and had developed a habit of praying as part of his coping strategy. He explained that martial arts and disciplined restraint were 2 of the methods he used to manage his impulses, and praying to Shikigami had been another. He added that a 4th method was the deliberate cultivation of routines. Rias frowned slightly at the idea of forming habits. Issei explained that a habit is a way of acting acquired through repetition. One repeats the same actions so often that they eventually become automatic. That, he said, was exactly what he had forced himself to do. He had developed many habits that helped him contain troubling impulses, strengthening his control so they were less likely to appear outside of set limits, although he had always remained cautious. Rias observed with a compassionate smile that his life had been difficult. Issei answered that if he had once given in to those impulses he might have been treated as a criminal or as someone unstable and confined for life, and that his childhood had been especially hard because he had not understood what was happening to him. Rias assured him that she understood and then asked, assuming those problems had truly been resolved now that he had become a demon, what he intended to do next. Issei considered that he would continue his life much as before while trying to accommodate his new demonic nature. Rias asked whether he planned to stop certain old behaviors from his past. Issei winced and admitted that some ingrained habits were not easy to break and that he was not ready to abandon them immediately. Rias appeared thoughtful and accepted his explanation as a reasonable line of thinking. When Issei asked if there were any other questions, Rias reassured him with a warm smile and declared it was time to move on. She stood, and the other members of the Occult Research Club arranged themselves around her. Issei hesitated, unsure of what to do, until a look from Rias told him he could remain where he was. Something in her eyes showed an amused anticipation. After a moment she announced that it was time to introduce themselves again and that Hyoudou would start. Hyoudou introduced himself as a second-year student and as a demon. Tuju Kaneko, the junior member, gave her name and said she was also a demon, keeping her voice steady and expression neutral. Himejima Akino stated that she was a third-year student and the club's vice president, and that she too was a demon. Rias Gremory then introduced herself as a demon of the Gremory household, noting her family's ducal rank and that she served as the club president, expressing a hope that they would get along well with Issei. Each time a member mentioned being a demon, a pair of black wings sprouted from their backs. Their wings resembled bat wings more than the angelic kinds Issei had seen before, giving them a slightly more intimidating air as they all turned to look at him. Issei assumed it was his turn to speak. Issei introduced himself as Hyoudou Issei, said that his friends called him Ise, and that he was a second-year student who appeared to be a demon now, expressing that he was pleased to meet them all. He managed to ignore an inner reaction as he spoke. Rias looked at her newest servant with a puzzled tilt of her head. Issei noticed her reaction and asked what the matter was. Rias said she had expected his wings to appear as well, but they had not. Issei asked if that was a problem, and Rias admitted she was unsure, noting she had never encountered a case like his. Normally, she explained, a new demon's wings would deploy instinctively in response to others' wings. Issei laughed, then explained that he had spent many years fighting impulses more powerful than his reason. Rias realized why his wings had not emerged at the first chance. For most newly reincarnated beings who did not naturally have wings before, the instinct would express itself freely. For Issei, the reaction had been only a faint urge, and his long years of self-discipline and martial training had kept him from acting on it. His fledgling wings had simply had no opportunity to assert themselves. Rias, regaining her composure, said it was time to begin work. She reached into her pocket, produced a flyer, and handed it to Issei, asking if he recognized it. Issei looked at the paper and then widened his eyes. He recognized the same flyer a strange girl in cosplay had given him before his first meeting with Yuma, a time he had once thought of as some kind of scam. Now that he knew the supernatural existed, he realized that almost anything could be possible. Rias explained that it was thanks to that flyer that she had been able to bring about his reincarnation. Rias told Issei that at the moment of his death he had summoned her, which had allowed her to grant him a new life. Issei listened thoughtfully, trying not to blush as he remembered his very last thought after Amano had left. He then asked how the process worked. Rias explained that nowadays almost no one knew how to draw a true pentagram to summon demons, so they produced leaflets with a simplified version. Those leaflets were distributed to people with strong avarice. When someone with sufficient avarice held such a leaflet and made a wish, demons were summoned before them. Issei frowned but remained silent for a moment. He then pointed out that he had never received such a leaflet in his life, which he found puzzling. Rias considered his question and offered her explanation. She said that although his human avarice had been noticeable in certain ways, he had fought against it, which might have disrupted their detection systems and prevented them from locating him. She also added that certain kinds of wishes were handled by other demons who specialized in those matters, and her group had chosen not to deal with them. That, she said, explained why no one had noticed the inconsistency earlier. Issei repeated the point that he could not have been located by their detection systems, as if verifying it. Rias confirmed the theory. He then looked Rias straight in the eyes and asked why he had received a leaflet on the day he died. He suspected the answer already and wanted it confirmed aloud. If he had never been targeted before, why would he suddenly receive one right before his meeting with Yuma, the meeting that had ended with his death? The coincidence did not seem convincing. Rias met his gaze for a few seconds and finally lowered her head. She apologized. Issei asked if she had known he would be killed that day and had chosen not to interfere, preparing the means to reincarnate him afterward. Rias closed her eyes and admitted that she had done exactly that. Issei absorbed the admission in a flat voice while the other members of the occult research club watched the exchange in silence. He had suspected as much. It was not a coincidence. Now that he understood the pieces of the puzzle, he realized Rias had reincarnated him because of his sacred gear, hoping it would be powerful. That explained her disappointment when she learned it was only a twice critical, which was apparently rather common. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He said that he wanted to be angry with her, and that he really did want to be. But he could not bring himself to be. Even if she had used him for her own goals, She had also lifted the heaviest burden he had carried in life, something he had struggled with for years without success. Besides, he told her, the meeting with Yuma remained a wonderful memory except for its tragic end. Rias reacted with visible unease at the turn of events. Issei then asked to continue and asked what the leaflets were for from the demon's perspective. Rias hesitated briefly and then explained. She said the system served several purposes. In the short term, demons received payment for their services. Long ago that might have involved souls, but they no longer took souls. Payment now came in money or material goods of value proportional to the difficulty of the requested wish. In that sense, it functioned like a job. A person invoked them with a leaflet, the demons fulfilled the request, then they had the summoner sign a contract confirming the work had been completed and collected their payment. A satisfied client was likely to return, sometimes requesting a particular demon. In Kuo at night, the members of the Occult Research Club handled general requests, but a client could ask for a specific member if they had a preference. Rias noted that everyone present, except for her and Issei, already had a loyal clientele and occasional new requests. Issei listened, genuinely interested, and asked what else the demons gained from making contracts with humans. Rias explained the medium-term benefit. The quality of a service and the difficulty of a contract increased a demon's power proportionally. Each individual increase was small, but accumulated over hundreds of contracts it made a noticeable difference. For young reincarnated demons, this method was the most practical way to gain strength quickly. Issei Hyoudou tapped his chin with a finger and asked whether the short and mid-term benefits she had mentioned meant there were long-term ones as well. Rias Gremory approved with a slight smile and explained that this was the last advantage. In the underworld, contracts carried value in the form of glory and prestige. Over the long term, accumulating hundreds of thousands of contracts could improve a demon's social class. Issei repeated that phrase, confused by the idea of social class. Rias adopted a more professorial tone and outlined the hierarchy within demon society. There were 4 broad categories: low-class devils, where reincarnated humans like him and the other club members started; middle-class devils, which served as an intermediate tier; high-class devils, generally associated with the nobility and where she herself stood; and ultimate-class devils at the top, the equivalent of royalty and the most powerful figures in their community. She added that each class contained ranks that further subdivided the hierarchy. Issei mentioned the family rank of Duke and asked if that was related. Rias confirmed that it was. She explained that ranks could be held from middle class upward. In order of importance she listed knight or dame, then baron or baroness. In high class the sequence continued with baron or baroness, viscount or viscountess, count or countess, margrave, and marquis or marchioness. In ultimate class the titles included prince or princess, duke or duchess, archduke or archduchess, king, grand king, and Satan. Issei frowned at the complexity. Rias asked if he had questions, and he admitted to 2. He wanted to know why there were no titles like queen or great queen, and why her family's rank seemed tied to the ultimate class even though she was high class. Rias responded calmly that demon society was strongly patriarchal, so the most significant ranks were traditionally male titles even when held by women. She then clarified the second point. Her family held the ducal title, and as the heir she would inherit it. Being a high-class devil did not negate that hereditary status. Her house had earned the rank in the past and could retain it indefinitely even if no current member reached ultimate class. Issei noticed a distant look in her eyes as she finished, suggesting there was more to the story, but he decided not to press the matter. There was already plenty of information to process. Issei said he thought he understood for the moment. Rias brightened and returned to the main topic. Contracts were a central part of demon life, so distributing leaflets was important because those contracts disappeared after use and required constant renewal. That was where he would help. Issei accepted the assignment with little enthusiasm but no objection and asked what he needed to do. Rias produced several stacks of flyers and placed a device on top that looked much like a GPS. Issei examined the device for a few seconds, expressionless, then met her gaze. Rias explained that it was a greed sensor, which would allow him to locate households whose level of greed was high enough that a demon could be summoned if the residents made a wish. Issei pocketed the device and considered it. Rias noticed his lack of motivation and raised an eyebrow, asking what his deepest desire was now that he was a demon. Issei hesitated. He admitted that, when he had been human, he had struggled with unhealthy impulses. Becoming a demon seemed to have changed that. He could not point to any clear, selfish goal now. Rias reacted with surprised eyebrows, finding it hard to believe a demon could be without at least one selfish thought. Issei finally allowed that there might be one thing. He hesitated, then said that he had considered forming a group of trusted companions whose role would be to help him manage his impulses and make sure he did not harm others. Rias considered this for a moment, thoughtful, and indicated that she could understand his reasoning. Rias informed Issei that in demon society, households with multiple companions were relatively common, and that if he chose to form one, the other demons would not only tolerate it but approve it. Issei remained silent for several minutes, then asked if such an arrangement would bother her. Rias replied that she took the well-being of her servants very seriously, because their happiness was her happiness. Issei did not seem fully convinced at first, but he finally nodded hesitantly and admitted that perhaps he could form his own circle of companions. He reflected that, although the compulsion that had once plagued him was gone, traces of his old impulses remained. He decided that creating a group like that would give him purpose as a newly reborn demon and serve as a kind of reconciliation with his life as a human. As long as those who joined did so willingly, he told himself, it could be a positive thing. Issei murmured that he understood, his eyes fixed on the page of a book. He was now lying on his bed. He had spent most of the night handing out the pamphlets Rias had given him. The task had been neither exciting nor pleasant, but it had been instructive. After relying on the greed detection GPS for the first 2 hours, Issei had developed the ability to identify, at a glance, houses likely to call on demons simply by the feel of the aura surrounding them. It was not exactly a sixth sense, but close. Returning home late had not earned him any scolding from his parents. They had only welcomed him back without asking where he had been. The Gremory family's influence on them, it seemed, was still in effect. Rias had told him that she had helped them accept his presence and that of those connected to her, which now included him since she had reincarnated him as a demon. In practice, that assistance meant they did not question comings and goings, no matter how odd or late. After settling in, Issei began to read the documents Rias had promised materials about Twice Critical. Apparently, Aquino had delivered them while he was distributing pamphlets. He had not known what to expect, but what he found surprised him: a vast collection of texts. Some were recent printed books, others older handwritten volumes, and a few were truly ancient parchments. There was even a fragment of papyrus among them. Had he been forced to read everything from start to finish, it would have taken months. Fortunately, Rias had arranged the materials. The first, smallest pile contained verified information about Twice Critical. The second collected speculative or poorly understood accounts related to the sacred gear in question. The third traced a chronology of Twice Critical, including biographies of its past bearers and how each had used the artifact. On top of the bed lay a single, substantial academic volume, an encyclopedic overview of sacred gears, with an alphabetical list of known artifacts and brief summaries of their powers. Issei began with that general book. He had no immediate interest in the list yet. He wanted to understand the fundamentals before focusing on Twice Critical. As someone trained in martial arts, he knew the importance of a solid foundation before specializing. The book explained that sacred gears, also called God's artifacts, were objects that granted abilities beyond ordinary human limits, said to be bestowed on humanity by the biblical God. The book clarified that by humanity it meant anyone whose DNA was at least 50% human. Only those who met that condition could legitimately receive a sacred gear. Most sacred gears manifested physically when used, but their true essence resided in the soul of their host. When a bearer died, the sacred gear did not vanish. Instead, it transferred to a new human. The text compared this transfer to a pseudo-reincarnation different from true reincarnation, but similar in its effects. The powers of sacred gears varied widely from one to another, Some created, some destroyed, some healed, and others inflicted harm. Some were suited to war, while others clearly aimed to preserve peace. Not all were fully understood, but the majority had been identified or were at least partially documented, and the confirmed total ran into the thousands. There were several categories used to classify sacred gears. Sacred gears based on state change were those whose abilities related to healing or enhancement. Those based on creation could produce matter or objects from nothing. Defense and counterattack sacred gears allowed the bearer to protect themselves or reflect and counter an opponent's attacks. Attribute or element-based sacred gears could generate a specific element or grant an attribute tied to an element. Time and space sacred gears could manipulate or directly influence time or space. Barrier and sealing sacred gears could interfere with an opponent's power or sacred gear, even isolating the opponent in some way. The Vritra category was special. Several sacred gears in this group contained a fragment of the dragon Vritra's soul, and the case was unique enough to merit its own classification. This led to another point. Sacred gears possessed consciousness, or at least a form of sentience. They were not merely tools or weapons. Some, like those linked to Vritra, even housed souls or soul fragments as their source of power. There was a theory that every sacred gear contained a soul or a fragment of one, but so far it had neither been confirmed nor disproved. If such souls existed, they were sealed so deeply or slumbering so soundly that current methods could not detect them. Still, there were many confirmed cases aside from Vritra, and for the rest it seemed clear that their power originated from somewhere. The consciousness or sensitivity of a sacred gear mattered because it responded to its user's will and often evolved alongside them. Sometimes that evolution produced drastic and somewhat unpredictable changes. Two particularly important cases illustrated this. The first was called balance breaker. It represented the ultimate state of a sacred gear, allowing access to its true power without restriction. Achieving it for the first time was extremely difficult, but once accomplished, repeating the process became easier. Balance breaker could also be induced artificially if a bearer sacrificed part of themselves, literally, but such forced activations were considered incomplete. The second phenomenon was known as a subspecies. A subspecies was a sacred gear whose traits had evolved from their base form to better suit the thoughts and emotions of their bearer. Because of that adaptation, a subspecies was generally more powerful than a standard sacred gear, being more tailored to its host. Sometimes a subspecies even acquired new abilities it was not expected to have. In theory, subspecies could vary infinitely depending on the sacred gear and its bearer. Balance breaker and subspecies were complementary but independent states. In balance breaker, a sudden, radical change in the heart of the bearer triggered the transformation. In a subspecies, it was the sacred gear itself that adapted to its bearer. There was no doubt that sacred gears were conscious or sensitive. Interestingly, a standard sacred gear could eventually evolve into a subspecies form of balance breaker, whereas a subspecies sacred gear could never reach the classic balance breaker form. Consequently, a subspecies would inevitably reach a subspecies form of balance breaker. Sacred gears were undeniably fascinating. Twice critical, also known as the Hand of the Dragon, was a relatively common dragon-type sacred gear classified among state changers. 173 distinct examples had been catalogued. Their appearances were similar aside from color, so color was often the only distinguishing feature. Its stated ability was to double the user's power for a limited time, generally for the duration that twice critical remained active. Overall, this aligned with what Rias had told Issei, though the documentation provided a more complete picture. Issei, however, was not fully satisfied with the description of twice critical's capabilities. He did not doubt the sacred gear doubling one's power was undeniably impressive, even if the ability itself seemed relatively common. What bothered him was that the available information felt erroneous or at least incomplete. He had not yet finished reading all the files Rias had given him, but he had already found inconsistencies. At one point he read that a previous bearer of a twice critical had been able to double the speed at which they moved. From what he had read, Issei defined power as potential destructive force or the amount of energy used in a given action. Using twice as much physical energy in a punch would make it twice as powerful. Likewise, expending twice as much magical energy in a spell would double its strength. Although those energies were not the same, twice critical seemed able to double both. Issei therefore assumed his sacred gear could double the amount of energy deployed in any action, automatically making his attacks twice as potent. Discovering that a few bearers, still only a handful, had directly doubled their speed forced Issei to revise his conclusions. Was twice critical capable of doubling things other than a user's overall power? Or had those individuals simply doubled the power in their legs to move twice as fast? If that were the case, then doubling muscular power would have been just as effective, if not more so. After all, he would become not only twice as fast but also twice as strong. So many mysteries and so much untapped potential. Issei resolved that as soon as he had the time, he would spend part of a day testing the limits of his newly unlocked sacred gear. For the moment, however, he had to prepare for class. He had spent the rest of the night researching the capabilities of twice critical and had not slept, though he did not feel especially tired. Apparently demons did not truly need sleep, though they rested to restore demonic energy more quickly and to relieve mental stress. Rias had also told him that with the reincarnation of other species into demons, the concept of sleep had become rather common. Hyoudou started his usual daily strength training in the basement, still unsettled by the amount of power his body could produce since becoming a demon. Eager to discover his new limits, he intensified his routine and pushed himself until exhaustion. After about an hour of exercise, he concluded that his body was now roughly 80% stronger than before his reincarnation, equivalent to about 180% of the power he had as a human. In daylight, however, that improvement was significantly reduced. From memory, at the zenith over the past 2 days he had even become slightly weaker than when he had been human, perhaps around 90% of his original strength. That had been an extreme case. Overall, he averaged around 130% of his former power. As he developed minor resistance to the light element, that percentage would continue to increase until he was as strong by day as by night, but Rias had warned that would probably take a few months. He enjoyed the feeling of hot water during his shower and allowed a simple, neutral memory of the club to pass through his mind before pushing it aside. He felt reassured that some aspects of his old personality remained familiar. The other changes his body was undergoing were already disconcerting enough. For a strange moment, he felt as if he were going through another round of adolescence. After drying off and dressing, he had a quick breakfast, grabbed his school bag, and headed to Jusqu'au Academy. It was still early and he had nothing better to do. If he could stop by the Occult Research Club, he might have time to experiment with twice critical. With that plan, he arrived at the school gates, only to find that the morning had other plans. A blue-haired girl with shoulder-length hair stood by the main gate in the school uniform. The uniform was tailored to emphasize the feminine form. Her eyes matched her hair but were a darker shade, and her features carried a somewhat androgynous, Bishounen-like quality. She was a little taller than Issei. This was Yura Tsubasa, a member of the student council and, back when he had been human, the person he had considered closest to a friend. He had no idea how their strange relationship might change now. Tsubasa greeted him with a bright smile. Issei returned the greeting with a polite nod and asked how she was. She said she was fine and, after a quick glance around, leaned in slightly and discreetly congratulated him on his reincarnation. Issei froze. How did Tsubasa know he had been reincarnated? More to the point, how did she know about the supernatural world? Panic rose briefly. He had not been prepared for this revelation. He worried for a moment that she might resent him, but her warm manner and personal congratulations suggested otherwise. He asked how she had found out. Tsubasa explained that Sona, the student council president, had informed her. Issei frowned, unsure he understood. She scratched her cheek sheepishly and pointed out that since he had only just been reincarnated, he probably did not yet know many things about the supernatural community. Then Tsubasa revealed that she was a demon as well. Issei reacted with surprise and asked since when she had been a demon. She answered that it had been since the beginning of the school year. The realization explained why she had seemed like she was holding back during their previous sparring. Tsubasa remarked, pleased, that he had been able to notice that restraint, which few people did. None had even suspected her true strength. Issei downplayed his victory as mere luck, but Tsubasa told him not to be so hard on himself. She reminded him that when he had been human he had forced her to use part of her demonic power, and even then he had exploited her underestimation to defeat her. It was a genuine feat, few humans could have managed it. Tsubasa considered herself to have lost their duel the moment she had been forced to use her demonic power. She took great pride in her close-quarters combat skills. Being beaten on technical grounds and pushed beyond human limits felt, to her, like a clear defeat. The worst, or perhaps the most impressive, depending on the viewpoint, was that even after tapping into her demonic strength she had still been put on her back, lying on the dojo floor and staring at the ceiling. Of course she had not told Issei that. Her defeat had made her question the very humanity of Issei Hyoudou. What kind of man could defeat a demon with bare hands, even if the demon had been holding back? Exorcists of the church were a special case, since they relied on sacred artifacts and light-based weapons. The boy she had fought had none of that. He had only his own body. No magic had been involved. Whoever he was, he must be extraordinary. Tsubasa was therefore shocked to discover that he was indeed wholly human. Because she was a member of the student council under President Shirtorai Sona, she had been able to access Issei's medical file, and what she read was astounding. According to the reports, Issei's body was the epitome of health. No excess fat, lean dense muscles honed by training so extreme that the word intensive barely covered it. The file confirmed that he was 100% human. Every Kuo Academy student's medical record carried a magical stamp visible only to those with supernatural power. The stamp indicated three things: whether the student was a supernatural being, whether they were aware of the supernatural world, and whether they had ever summoned a demon to make a wish. Issei was negative on all three counts, though there was a special note suggesting he might be a carrier of a sacred gear, which remained to be confirmed. Having learned this, Tsubasa was even more impressed. He had trained his body to human limits. Had he been aware of the supernatural world, he might have pushed even further. Even so, he could hold his own against some weaker supernatural creatures. Born in another era, he might have been called a hero. Perhaps it was better that he had been born in modern times. Tsubasa genuinely admired Issei. There was, however, one other small note on the medical file, written in ordinary ink and so tiny that she might have missed it if she were not a demon. The entry mentioned a personal issue the boy was dealing with. Tsubasa first felt skeptical, then sympathetic, because he appeared to be trying hard to manage whatever it was. After some time she had asked President Sona whether anything could be done to make his time at Kuo Academy more comfortable. After a little persuasion and research into Issei's reliability, President Sona had agreed to try to help. Several students had volunteered to assist in supervised ways to support him. Tsubasa herself had been included among them. Tsubasa then brightened and introduced herself properly now that the truth was out. She was Tsubasa, a reincarnated demon and the rook of Shirtorai Sona. Issei, uncertain, introduced himself as Issei Hyoudou, a reincarnated demon, and asked what the rook title meant. Tsubasa asked whether Rias had not explained. Issei explained that Rias had given him so much information the previous day that she had suggested he take time to absorb it before learning more. Tsubasa agreed that it made sense. President Sona had done the same for the student council, only in a different order. Issei then frowned and asked whether President Sona was also a demon and whether she had reincarnated Tsubasa. Tsubasa confirmed that President Sona was indeed her king and that all student council members were part of her peerage. Issei repeated unfamiliar titles and expressed that he should ask Rias for a fuller explanation. Tsubasa suggested letting Rias explain the peerage, rook, and king system in detail to avoid her giving an incomplete account. Issei agreed with a smile that he would let Rias decide the right moment to explain. With time remaining before classes began, Tsubasa proposed a friendly rematch, saying it would be a kind of revenge for the fight they had during his human days. Issei shrugged and agreed to the idea, telling her to show him the way. Issei and Tsubasa faced each other on the school rooftop, about 10 meters apart. They had chosen the place because no one ever went up there. As a precaution, Tsubasa Yura had created a minor magical barrier so their duel would be hidden from ordinary eyes. Other demons at Kuo Academy could still detect it and pass through, but that did not matter, they were not hiding from other demons. Their duel would go beyond human limits. Tsubasa took a guarded stance and asked if he was ready. Issei Hyoudou confirmed that he was more ready than ever and adjusted his posture to suit his style. Tsubasa signaled to begin and launched herself at him. Issei barely thought that she was fast before he dodged a punch that grazed his cheek. He recognized the power of a demon. The difference from their previous fight was considerable. Back then Tsubasa had restrained her true abilities to appear human, and his opponent had been human and had won because she had been underestimated. That would not happen again. He felt stronger than before, even if daylight weakened him. He still exceeded his human maximum. Issei responded with a kick aimed at the abdomen, which Tsubasa easily avoided. Using the momentum, she countered with a sharp strike to his side, but Issei evaded once more. He tried to follow with a judo hold and failed. Tsubasa's speed made each of his attempts ineffective. She was stronger too, though she held back enough not to defeat him with a single blow. Her final move in that exchange pushed him back at a moment when he might otherwise have been dazed, because his defensive attempt had been too weak. The fight continued as strikes and counters flew in fast succession. Tsubasa's brow creased, and Issei mirrored the expression. Despite his increased power, his attacks felt much like they had a week earlier. Speed, striking force, reactivity all roughly the same. Could that be another side effect of daylight? For some reason he doubted it. The sun already weakened him by nature. An additional harmful side effect made no sense. Confused, Issei pressed on with the spar. He was clearly at a disadvantage, and the situation worsened as time went on. Tsubasa restrained herself less and less, forcing him into technical maneuvers just to avoid taking hits. He did not feel tired, but he simply could not keep up with her pace. Was this how power differences between demons worked? Was he really that weak? He forced himself to stay calm and not panic. 2 days earlier he had held his own against a fallen angel. Granted, it had been night and had made him stronger, but he had managed to fight despite unequal conditions. From what he had seen, Tsubasa was not much stronger than that angel. She specialized in close combat while the man had used ranged attacks. Even so, the gap should not have been this wide. Something was off. Tsubasa's frown deepened and she accelerated her tempo. Issei could no longer counterattack. He focused solely on evasion and, when necessary, on blocking incoming strikes. There was no point in trying to deflect them, he would be incapable. He could see her moves and his eyes tracked them, but his body could not keep up. He had never been so unable to react to a stronger opponent. He wondered if it would have been the same against Yuma. Tsubasa, slightly irritated, stated that it was useless if he did not take her seriously. Issei protested that he did take her seriously and felt offended. Tsubasa demanded that he prove it and pointed out that she saw no difference between his current abilities and those from their last fight. She insisted he could not be at the same level since his reincarnation. Issei noted that he was not the only one to come to that conclusion and vowed he was doing his best. Tsubasa accused him of lying, grimacing in disapproval. She observed that he was sweating less than she was, which suggested he was not giving his all, and added that he had not activated his sacred gear. Tsubasa was right. Issei had not realized it until she pointed it out. He had felt outclassed through the fight, but now he noticed he was far from the exhaustion he would have if he had truly been as outmatched as he had believed. He also had not used his sacred gear simply because it was still too new for him to use it on reflex. It was time to change that. Issei reset his stance and activated twice critical. A red glove appeared on his left arm and he immediately felt his power double. He breathed in, savored the surge for a moment, then charged back into the fight. He rushed toward Tsubasa and threw a punch she dodged. Anticipating her counter, he evaded and slipped past her guard, landing the first solid hit of the match as his knee struck her midsection. Issei recoiled in confusion. Tsubasa had not visibly flinched at the blow. It was almost as if she had not felt it. In fact, judging by the angry look on the young woman's face, she had indeed taken little if any damage. Issei ran a hand over the spot where her knee had struck him and returned her glare with fury. She was clearly not pleased. Tsubasa asked angrily what he thought he was doing, insisting she was not fragile and demanding why he continued to hold back against her, whether he had so little respect for her that he would keep insulting her like that. Issei insisted that he had truly struck with all his strength and swore it, bewildered. Tsubasa called him a liar and launched herself at him. She grabbed Hyoudou Issei's arm, twisted it, and tried to hold it in a painful lock. Issei grunted from the pressure but managed after a few seconds to free himself and even reverse their positions. It was obvious, however, that his strength was far weaker than hers, because she easily pushed him back with a violent kick to the abdomen that sent him several meters away, leaving him breathing heavily. He got to his feet with difficulty but did not immediately re-engage. Tsubasa likewise did not charge again, watching him with an inscrutable expression. She frowned in confusion and observed that he had not been lying about using all his abilities. If he had held back, he would have defeated her when he managed that ground hold. But the situation made no sense. His body did not appear exhausted, yet he could not push himself further. He had also used twice critical, but his attack power had not changed. Instead of doubling, it had remained exactly the same. Tsubasa looked visibly exasperated. All her hopes from this confrontation had been dashed. Issei felt the same frustration. He had used every ability and every combat technique he knew to fight his friend, and yet twice critical had produced no difference in his attacks. That perception was wrong, though. He had felt his body's power double. It simply had not translated into stronger strikes. Issei murmured that his attack power had not changed even though his body's power had doubled, and then his eyes widened as a realization began to form. Yura, noticing the change in his demeanor, called to him. Issei asked Tsubasa, impatiently, how demonic power worked and how she used it. Tsubasa admitted uncertainty, saying she used it instinctively. Issei stared at her for several seconds and then let out a sudden, almost hysterical laugh, surprising his friend. He had finally understood the problem. The explanation was simple and yet would have escaped him. Demons were creatures of instinct. They could learn spells and train to grow stronger, but the foundation of their power rested on pure instinct. At the most primitive level, their instincts governed their fighting strength. Issei had spent half his life fighting against his instincts. Just as he had restrained his wings, he had exercised such control over his body that he had unconsciously suppressed the slightest impulse he had felt. Now that he had been reincarnated as a demon, that meant his new demonic power was effectively sealed in the same way, leaving him at roughly the same level he had been as a human. His sacred gear, being dragon type, also functioned through instinct. It was no wonder he felt weak while exhibiting greater endurance than ever. Taking a deep breath, Issei forced his body to relax. What he was about to do was something he would not normally have considered, but being a demon felt different, and he was willing to take the risk to see whether he was right. He was about to release his instincts from the chains he had wrapped around them. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and then opened them. Issei told Tsubasa to be ready. He advanced. Tsubasa reacted a fraction too slowly. She saw his fist coming straight toward her sternum and could only catch the strike with both hands, absorbing it as best she could. To her surprise, she was driven back more than a meter before regaining her balance. Her hands felt slightly numb from the impact. Issei was smiling. He announced that he finally understood what the problem had been. Tsubasa said she was glad for him and took her stance again. Issei shook his head and refused to continue the fight, explaining that he did not know the current limits of his body and that if they kept fighting like that one of them could end up injured, which he did not want. Tsubasa watched him for a moment, then sighed and said she understood, admitting it had been unreasonable to ask for a fight while he was still getting used to his new demon body and apologizing. Issei waved the apology away and said she should not be sorry, because thanks to her he might never have understood why he could not use more power than when he had been human. Tsubasa nodded, a small twitch at the corner of her lips, and the mood between them relaxed. Yura smiled despite herself, checked her watch, and frowned, telling Issei that it was time to go because classes were about to start. Issei replied distractedly that he would see her later. The day passed relatively quickly. Issei remained partly focused on discovering why he had been so weak during his fight with Tsubasa. For a demon, instinct was practically life itself. A demon without instinct was like a cyclist without a bicycle. Something fundamental was missing. As a human, Issei had always feared his instincts because they had been tied to troubling urges. That trauma had not entirely disappeared, and he was determined not to be controlled by those impulses. Still, he understood that, because of his reincarnation, some compromises would be necessary. After classes ended, the newly reincarnated boy went to the Occult Research Club room in Kuo Academy's old building, where Rias, Akino, Yuto, and Kaneko were already waiting. As before, the room was dim, curtains drawn over the windows, and candles scattered about provided the only light. Rias greeted him with a smile and asked how his day had gone. Issei shrugged and said it had been all right. Rias then inquired about his fight with Tsubasa with a knowing smile. Issei admitted that he was not surprised she knew about it and explained that he had struggled at first with a problem related to his instincts that was now resolved. Otherwise, the match had gone fairly well. Rias expressed relief and asked about his research on twice critical. Issei replied that he had some ideas but nothing concrete yet. Rias considered this for a moment, then announced that Issei's leaflet distribution duty was finally over and that it was time for him to begin performing actual demon work. She told him that from today he would start making his own contracts. Issei smiled slightly. He understood that a demon truly became one by fulfilling at least a single contract, a sort of rite of passage. He intended to honor Rias for giving him a second chance at life, even if repaying such a debt felt almost impossible. Rias explained that because he was newly reincarnated, he had no clients yet and needed to build a clientele. There were two methods: accept a general request that could summon any demon of the Gremory clan in the city if no specific demon was requested, or take a club member's contract, with their permission, and fulfill it on their behalf. She noted that swapping contracts was usually avoided because clients preferred the specific demon they had asked for. Issei said he understood so far. Rias decided to use the second method for the day. She revealed that Kaneko had 2 pending contracts that evening and would have difficulty completing both in time, so she authorized Issei to take one with Kaneko's consent. Kaneko quietly lowered her head and asked for help. Issei promised earnestly that he would do his best. Rias clapped her hands in approval and instructed him to stand in the center of the magic circle. Issei looked at the large pentagram drawn on the floor, which he had seen on his last visit. He could sense a mystical power emanating from it, perhaps a demonic affinity of some kind. He stepped confidently into the center of the circle and Rias stepped closer. Rias asked him to offer his hand. Issei complied. She placed her right index finger on the center of his palm and channeled a small amount of demonic energy. In less than a second, a bright red glow appeared in his palm, forming a circle. Despite its fiery color, there was no heat or pain. Issei watched the phenomenon until it faded. Rias explained that the seal had been engraved and that it would allow him to teleport directly to a client who summoned him. Issei looked at his palm and thought it was pretty cool. Rias then told him it was time to go to the client and fulfill his first contract. Issei nodded and focused, closing his eyes to link the seal on his hand to the magic circle beneath him. He felt a slight resistance and strained a bit harder. An intense scarlet light flashed behind his eyelids, signaling that the teleportation was underway. When it subsided, he opened his eyes only to find himself still in the Occult Research Club room. Rias apologized and explained that he could not use the circle to teleport to the client. She went on to say, somewhat awkwardly, that the magic circle required a certain amount of demonic power to function. Even a child usually had enough demonic power to teleport, but that was not the case for Issei. The news hit Issei like a slap. Being told he had less power than a child always bruised a person's ego. It was humiliating, made worse by the fact that his failure had been public. All the members of the Occult Research Club had witnessed his lack of power. Wait a second, a lack of demonic energy? Issei Hyoudou smiled faintly. Issei invoked twice critical and caused his sacred gear to manifest, intending to try again. He expected teleportation, But the second attempt failed disastrously, worse than the first. This revealed that Issei had less than half the demonic energy required to perform the most basic underworld teleportation, an ability even the youngest demons could manage. Humiliation no longer sufficed to describe how he felt. Rias Gremory sighed and rubbed her temple with 2 fingers, noting that they could not let the client down and that Issei would have to go somehow. Issei replied that he had suspected as much and felt slightly downcast. Kaneko encouraged him, offering him strength. Issei thanked Kaneko sincerely. Rias pressed him to hurry so the client would not be kept waiting. Issei sighed and agreed. Issei left the clubroom quickly and rushed out of Kuo Academy. Using the GPS Rias had given him the day before, he located the client. By fortunate coincidence, the Hyoudou residence was along the way, so he could pick up his bicycle en route and cut some time. Between his impressive demonic speed, his relentless martial arts stamina, and the doubling effect of twice critical, he was already moving at a pace a human would consider impossible. It took him about 5 minutes to complete the trip once he retrieved his bike, far faster than the 20 minutes it would have taken as a human, and he felt reasonably satisfied with himself. He almost forgot the shame of being unable to teleport, but the feeling returned. Sighing, Issei dispelled twice critical and knocked on the client's apartment door. The door opened slightly to reveal a man in his 30s with long brown hair. The man ordered him to go away and began to close the door. Issei protested, reminding him that he had indeed summoned a demon. The man demanded to know what kind of demon would knock at the door. Issei answered that it was better not to talk about it. The man insisted that the flyer had shown Kaneko appearing from the magic circle and that the demon he had called was Kaneko. Issei explained miserably that he knew, but Kaneko could not come, and he had been asked to replace her. He added that this was his very first contract, that he did not yet know how these things were supposed to proceed, and that his demonic power was too weak to present himself as Kaneko. He admitted that, as a demon, that was humiliating, and he begged not to be humiliated further, nearly in tears by the end. After a pause, the man reopened the door and told him it was fine to come in. The man introduced himself as Morisawa. His apartment matched the stereotypical otaku den, with hundreds of manga and anime neatly lined on shelves. Morisawa seated Issei at a table and served green tea. Issei felt more like a guest than the contractor he was supposed to be, an unfamiliar but not unpleasant sensation. He decided to go with the flow and see how things developed. Morisawa asked, curious about the demon's powers, and told Issei to show them. Issei asked what kind of ability Kaneko had, trying to gauge expectations. Morisawa cheerfully described Kaneko as a cosplay princess who would cradle him gently as part of her roleplay. Issei regarded him oddly and thought that being a demon might not be necessary for that, but he chose not to comment. Morisawa repeated his question about Issei's power. Issei hesitated and then presented twice critical. When the red glove appeared on Issei's left hand, Morisawa reacted with interest and asked what it did. Issei explained, with some uncertainty, that in theory it doubled his power. Morisawa compared it to the Kaioken used by Goku, noting the similarity. Issei agreed that it was somewhat similar, explaining that twice critical produced comparable effects without the same physical strain, that might be due to his martial arts training allowing him to handle the accumulation of power. He added that since he was not particularly strong at the moment, the effect was not very impressive. Morisawa hummed and suggested that Issei's martial training might be relevant, comparing it to how Goku trained to master the Kaioken without risk, allowing him to use it effectively later. Issei reflected aloud that he had trained as if his life depended on it, like Goku in a different context, and wondered whether he might one day use twice critical in a similar way to multiply his power. Morisawa responded with excitement at the possibility, and thus began a long conversation filled with theories about the abilities of twice critical. Rias wore an expression too complex to read. She sighed and called Issei by name. Issei hesitated, feeling a little embarrassed and not very proud of himself, and asked what she meant. Rias asked him to explain. He had talked about manga with the client, but what happened after that, and what about the contract? Issei recalled that he had spent much of the previous night with Morisawa, and together they had devoted most of that time to forming theories about twice critical's powers. Because of similarities to various manga and anime, such as Dragon Ball, the topic had clearly fascinated Morisawa and confirmed his status as an otaku. Issei liked the man, not only for his knowledge but because he had been pleasant company. He could not explain things any other way, that was essentially what had happened. He did not want to reveal every detail, especially so soon, since he barely knew the man beyond his reputation and therefore had to remain cautious. Issei admitted that the contract had become invalid because the request for which a demon had been summoned had not been fulfilled. He hoped he would not have to explain further. After all, him wearing a cosplay outfit intended for someone else would have been an insult to himself, to Kaneko, and to the costume. In the end, they had spent the night talking and comparing their opinions about various manga. Rias fell silent for several seconds, then sighed again. She explained that after a contract, whether it succeeds or fails, they asked the client to fill out the questionnaire on the back of the pamphlet they had been given. Essentially a single question about how the contract with the summoned demon had been. She produced a sheet of paper and said that once completed, the responses appeared on that notice. She handed the paper to Issei, who took it and read it with curiosity. Issei read the main responses. The client said it had been fun, that it was the first time he had such an enjoyable time, that he wanted to summon Issei again, and that he hoped to make a good contract with him next time. Nearly all the answers on the questionnaire were similarly positive. Issei could find no negative comments, which made his confusion over Rias's expression deepen. Rias admitted that she had never received feedback like that before and did not quite know how to react. From a demon's point of view, the important thing was to complete a contract with the person who summoned them so they could receive their reward. By that standard, Issei had clearly failed. On the other hand, he had made the client happy, and making the client happy was also the purpose of a contract. Rias found the situation unprecedented and puzzling because it did not fit the usual pattern. She then observed that this made Issei unique. There had never been a demon like him. If similar events continued, he would become the underworld's most unpredictable demon. For a moment, Issei imagined himself in bright orange clothes, laughing and preparing pranks, and wondered if his hair would turn yellow. Rias reminded him to remember the basics, make contracts with clients, grant the client's wishes, and receive the agreed reward. Issei acknowledged that he would do his best. Rias added that the client Morisawa had noted on his satisfaction questionnaire that he was withdrawing from Kaneko's regular client list, except for the occasional summons, and that from now on this client would be assigned to Issei. Issei answered that he understood. Issei nodded with determined resolve. Kaneko lowered her head slightly, just enough to hide her gaze, and thanked Issei for his efforts as her senior. Issei, surprised and confused, asked what she meant. Akino laughed softly, amused, and explained that Kaneko had not liked the client's requests but had been unable to refuse them because of contractual obligations. Their little cat had been awkward about showing it but was relieved to no longer have to deal with Morisawa. Issei admitted that it had been a pleasure, he supposed. Rias, smiling strangely, informed Issei that another contract offer was available for him that evening and suggested he hurry if he did not want to be late. For some reason, Issei had a bad feeling about this contract. It had to do with the club president's smile. There was something about it that gave him chills. All the newly reincarnated boy knew about this client was that he was a regular of Hyoudou. Like Kaneko the day before, Kiba had several other requests to handle during the same PRD and would have difficulty taking on this one because of an obvious lack of time. Now that he thought about it, the situation seemed odd. Issei might be mistaken, but he found it strangely convenient that, every day, one of his occult research club mates ended up overloaded with requests. From what he had understood the day before, this was supposed to be a rare occurrence. Yet this was already the second time in 2 days. Something was happening. Issei did not know what exactly, but he was certain he would discover it soon. All he had to do was go to his client's place, and if he was not wrong, he would finally understand what was going on. His thoughts drifted to yesterday's contract, the one he had spectacularly failed to complete. Ironically, that failure had turned out to be rather fruitful for him. It had apparently been good for Kaneko as well, since she had gotten rid of a client she disapproved of. Following that line of thought, Issei would not have been surprised if Hyoudou had done the same today if Hyoudou had been the one who proposed the contract. He doubted it a little, though, because it did not quite fit Hyoudo's Prince Charming persona. He was almost certain Rias had made the decision, perhaps as a way to test the limits of her newest servant. After all, she was a high-ranking demon. It was not a mindset the newly reincarnated fully approved of, but he could not say he disapproved either. Could he really judge the logic of a non-human by his own human standards? Of course not. He also knew that, because of his reincarnation, his own rationality would evolve over time, gradually becoming a little closer to that of demons. That did not mean it would become identical to theirs. But he was digressing. The day before, Issei and Morisawa had spent a significant amount of time developing theories about twice critical. The most likely idea, and the first one they had thought of, was that it functioned like the Kaioken technique from the Dragon Ball series. The concept in the manga and the mechanism behind his sacred gear were relatively similar, at least based on what he had concluded from his research. In Dragon Ball, the term power is defined as a person's potential for destruction. That fit remarkably well with Issei's own definition. At its base, Kaioken doubled the user's power, which was the exact effect of twice critical, the ability Issei possessed. For that reason he and Morisawa had placed significant credence in the theory that the two concepts were essentially the same. Morisawa had even suggested that the idea of Kaioken might have been inspired by twice critical. Chronologically, that could be possible. After all, that type of sacred gear was not particularly rare, and many humans had possessed them. It would not be strange if Toriyama Akira, the author of Dragon Ball, had once possessed twice critical or had witnessed the power of one. That could also explain the manga's name, given that Issei's sacred gear was dragon type. Issei could not prove this part of the theory, nor did he really want to, but he thought it was a cool possibility. The theory equating Kaioken with twice critical followed two lines of reasoning, roughly summarized as substance and form. In substance, twice critical should work the same way as Kaioken. Rather than simply doubling a user's power, it would multiply it. The idea was based on Kaioken's ability to stack in order to proportionally increase the user's power. Naturally, Kaioken came with a weakness. It could injure the user if the body was not naturally strong enough to withstand the strain. For some reason, Issei had only been able to awaken twice critical after becoming a demon after his body had gained supernatural resilience. Still, the documents Rias had provided indicated that it was possible to awaken his sacred gear while still human. That had happened often in the past, typically during wartime. It was also confirmed that using twice critical as a human would destroy the user's body, because it could not handle the influx of power. From this, Issei arrived at a conclusion. Some sacred gears had awakening conditions designed to preserve their owner's health. Twice critical could therefore be awakened only when the owner's body was ready to accept the sudden increase in power, unless the owner was in a state of intense emotional distress, in which case the safety would deactivate on its own. After all, as Rias had said, a sacred gear responded to the will of its user. Because he had never experienced the kind of emotional distress necessary to trigger the twice critical effect while he was human, Issei had never awakened it before. Once he became a demon, however, his body had become resilient enough for it to respond without issue. Based on the concept of the energy boost technique, it should be possible for twice critical to do more than simply double its wielder's power. After all, the technique multiplied energy. In its base form, the energy boost X2 doubled power, but that was only the basic version. In the manga and the anime, Goku could overuse the technique and stack its effects. Energy boost X3 tripled strength, X4 quadrupled it, X5 quintupled it. The same principle should apply to twice critical, yet a sacred gear only answered to the will of its user. Someone convinced that twice critical only doubled power would never push beyond that limit. Rias's files mentioned a case in which a twice critical user allegedly quadrupled his power, but the final report, after the individual's death, concluded he must have been carrying two twice criticals. It was possible, but Issei preferred to believe his own theory, especially since the old hypothesis had never been confirmed. The form of the technique was subtler and more intriguing. A passage in the manga described the energy boost as a method to control all the body's energy and amplify it for a time. With good mastery, one could multiply strength, speed, destructive power, and defense. But if energy could not be controlled and contained, one could suffer serious harm. What made this notable beyond the multiplier idea was the target of the multiplication. It was not limited to raw power alone. It could be applied directly to physical strength, speed, defense, and potentially anything one could conceive so long as it remained within the person's body. The multiplier could not be transferred to anything beyond the skin, even if it was in contact with it. Goku had been able to share energy with Krillin for the spirit bomb against Vegeta, but that was energy transfer, not the energy boost technique itself, so it did not count in the same way. Issei believed the energy boost and twice critical were equivalent because of how twice critical presented itself. Rias's documents reported that some past twice critical wielders had done more than double their power, some had doubled their speed, for example. The report suspected this was a subtype of twice critical, but there had been no confirmation. It was a lot of theory and little concrete proof. His belief was not blind faith. Issei relied on results. He and Morisawa had formulated the idea together, but that alone did not make it weighty. What mattered were outcomes, and there had been outcomes. That morning, after his usual workout, Issei had tested the theory because he had strong hope for it and because sacred gears responded to their wielder's will. He committed himself to the experiment until proven otherwise. If nothing behaved differently from the accepted norm, he would accept it. At first, nothing happened. After more than 2 hours of trial and error, though, the reincarnated boy managed not to double his power but to double his physical strength. For a martial artist like him, the difference between power and physical strength was minimal, almost negligible, but the result was real. Perhaps the slight distinction between power and physical strength had allowed the change. Since Hyoudou had never successfully multiplied anything other than power or physical strength before, he could only assume his idea was correct so far. That did not mean he would stop. A small improvement proved that more might be possible. This was why Issei held to the energy boost equals twice critical theory. He still had not multiplied his power beyond twofold or multiplied anything other than power or physical strength, but part of the theory had already been validated. There was no reason the rest could not be. Besides, it had only been a day of experiments. Getting any result at all was impressive. Sighing, Issei finally reached his destination. This was not a time for distracting thoughts. He had failed to complete his first contract because of an exceptional situation. Now it was time to show that that failure had been an exception. He would succeed this time, but he wanted to be fully focused just in case. He dismounted his bike and parked it to the side, checking the time. An ordinary person would have taken half an hour to make this trip. Issei had taken less than 10 minutes. As he walked toward the door, he hoped the client would not be too angry about the delay. For better or worse, teleportation was not an option yet. He steeled his resolve and pressed the intercom. He wondered briefly whether the summoner would be a man or a woman, young or old, and why they would need a demon's help. His thoughts were interrupted when someone answered through the intercom. In itself, it was curious, but Issei Hyoudou told himself the person might simply be shy and reluctant to open the door, so he did not think too much of it. A deep masculine voice invited him in and said the door was open. Issei frowned in confusion. The voice carried no trace of timidity, but that was not what unsettled him. His summoner, a man as indicated by the voice, had a speech tic that would have suited a child or a young woman more than an adult male. For some reason, the bad feeling Issei had briefly set aside grew stronger. He opened the door and stepped inside, bracing himself for anything. He was not prepared for what he found. A gigantic figure filled the room. It appeared to be a man Issei assumed as much, towering well over 2 meters, with a physique so massive it could have belonged to the most extreme bodybuilder. From Issei's martial arts-kept knowledge of anatomy, he noticed the musculature looked entirely natural, as if driven by an abnormal concentration of hormones, far beyond anything Issei had experienced. The costume the man wore was clearly too small, buttons straining and seams threatening to pop. The costume was that of a magical girl. Cat ears, the kind cosplayers favored, perched atop his head. The term man no longer seemed to fit. He was an overwhelming presence. His posture and the force radiating from him conveyed an intense, utterly focused will and aura that felt crushing. In the past, Issei had naively believed his desperate physical training had brought him close to the top, but standing here he realized that had been an illusion. The older Issei would not have stood a chance against this being. Even now, victory felt uncertain. And yet there was something disarming. The creature's eyes held a purity and innocent hope that contradicted its overwhelming appearance. That look reminded Issei of someone he had once known, naive and desperate, willing to try anything from science to religion, and finally turning to demons as a last resort. In another life he might have been in the same position. Understanding this, Issei straightened, breathed in and out, and prepared to address his summoner. Issei asked whether they had requested a demon, his tone steady and confident. The invoker nodded and explained that he had called the demon because he wanted to make a wish. Issei realized that was, after all, why he had been summoned, though the shock of seeing his client had made him forget for a moment. He composed himself. He would hear the man's wish and grant it once the contract was established. He simply had to focus on the task and ignore everything else. The towering man announced that Miltan wanted to become a magical girl. Issei repeated the request to be sure he had heard correctly, then thought that such a demand was beyond his or anyone's ability. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and wondered if there were gentler alternatives than invoking demonic power. The client insisted that Miltan had already tried everything: rituals, voyages across dimensions, and yet had never managed to become a magical girl. The only option left, the man explained softly, was to ask the enemy him, the demon, for help. Issei judged the situation hopeless and held back a sympathetic grimace as he tried to remain professional. The man called for the demon with a nearly sung plea and an intensity that made the air seem to press in. The pressure of his presence grew and made Issei's legs tremble. Even though the eyes had shown no harm, the aura felt overwhelming, as if danger could strike at any moment. Swallowing hard, Issei realized it was time to decide. Not yet. The final words left a small thread of hope. Despite the claim of wanting to become a magical girl, the nature of the request was different. The being simply wanted magical powers. Perhaps an energy transfer would work, like Goku had done for Krillin during their fight against Vegeta. In itself, that was much simpler to accomplish than an actual physical transformation. Not that Issei could do it yet, but the idea existed. Such a contract might be possible later. For the moment, however, he could not. Issei apologized, bowing, and explained that he was unable to fulfill the wish at that time. Miltan decided with a bright smile that they would watch Magical Girl Spiral 7 Alternative together, the smile masking deep disappointment as his aura subsided to a more tolerable, though still unusually strong, glow. Issei did not have the nerve to point out that he was not technically obliged to stay, since the contract had not been signed. His summoner needed emotional support, and Issei was more than willing to offer it for free, having understood exactly how Miltan felt. He had been in a similar state just a week earlier. With a sincere, if strained, smile, the newly reincarnated boy followed the man into the living room, and they watched the anime for much of the night. Needless to say, his second contract was about as successful as his first, a total failure. The next day, Issei felt exhausted. It was not physical tiredness so much as a deep mental weariness. The previous night had been intense in more ways than one. Miltan had a completely unusual personality, and not only in his desire to become a true magical girl. Despite his peculiar way of thinking, he was pleasant to be around, and Issei found himself enjoying their conversations more than once. So, staying near him for too long felt oppressive. An ordinary person might feel drained simply from looking at the summoner. It was exhausting in the end. His unusual fatigue did not stop him from keeping his daily routine. Issei completed his morning exercise and then continued experiments with his twice critical. Progress was slow. For now, he could only double his power or his physical strength. Those three concepts remained fixed, though he did not give up hope of changing that someday. The process would be easier if he understood what he was trying to achieve, but for the moment he fumbled along blindly. On the bright side, he was getting faster at activating his sacred gear, which was encouraging. When he arrived at the occult research club, Rias looked puzzled again. That did not surprise him. Encountering the same unprecedented case twice in the history of the underworld was not common. Hyoudou had tried to laugh about it, which only made Issei feel more depressed. For some reason he kept imagining himself in a bright orange outfit with golden hair, an idea he still did not like. A surprised cry and the sound of something falling made Issei turn reflexively. He saw a young woman who, judging by her clothing, appeared to be a nun. More important than her attire was the fact that she had tripped on perfectly flat ground and fallen in an awkward, embarrassing way that left her visibly flustered. She was the only one who had witnessed the mishap. Issei suppressed an amused, resigned sigh and moved to help her. He offered his hand and asked if she was all right. The woman made a small, apologetic noise and explained that she kept stumbling over nothing. She thanked him sincerely and accepted his help, allowing him to pull her to her feet. A sudden breeze lifted her veil and revealed long golden hair falling to her lower back, framed by a center-parted fringe and emerald eyes that shone with innocence. Her face combined purity and naivety in a striking way. Issei thought she looked almost angelic, and his heart beat a little faster at the sight. The nun looked at him with concern and asked if something was wrong. Issei apologized for his distraction and told her he had been absent-minded. She breathed a sigh of relief. Noticing her suitcase, Issei asked whether she was traveling. She explained that she had been transferred to the church in this town and offered a shy greeting. She admitted that she had gotten lost and could not speak Japanese well, so she had trouble being understood. Issei was not surprised. Since becoming a demon, he had a passive demonic ability called language that automatically translated speech, and it worked both ways. From what he could tell, she was speaking a European language, perhaps Spanish or French. He offered to guide her to the church, and she replied with a bright, grateful smile. Asia declared that their meeting must have been God's will. Issei winced inwardly but did not show it. He thought he should have seen it coming. Yet he decided she was too sweet to hold it against her, especially since she could not have known what would happen. He resolved that she must never find out. Never. He did not want her to discover that he was a demon, and therefore technically on the enemy side. For now he wanted only to be a normal boy helping an ordinary girl, without having to worry about the supernatural. That had been his intention, but the rosary resting on his chest complicated matters. The artifact seemed blessed in a way that unsettled him, and he had to force himself to ignore the uneasy sensations it stirred. Fortunately, he had learned to control his instincts and moved past the discomfort. As the pair walked through a park, something else helped him avert his attention. A child suddenly began crying after scraping his knee. The nun hurried to help without hesitation, asking if he was all right and gently patting his head to comfort him. She told him to be brave. The child, confused through his tears, did not understand the words, but a moment later a soft green light flowed from the nun's hands placed above the scrape. The wound visibly shrank and soon became no more than a bad memory. Issei stiffened at the sight. His left hand had reacted to the manifestation of the power. He instinctively understood what it was. He realized it was a sacred gear. The nun informed the child that the pain should be gone now with a sympathetic smile, then turned to Issei and apologized for having to act. The child thanked the nun exuberantly, and Issei relayed the gratitude. His eyes drifted to the young woman's hands almost by reflex. The power she had just used was unmistakable. The nun explained that it was the power to heal, a wonderful ability entrusted to her by God, and her smile had a tinge of sadness. Issei noted that she did not seem entirely happy to possess such a gift and wondered if there was more to it. Neither of them spoke further about the incident as they resumed walking. The nun, though comfortable with her ability, did not appear eager to discuss it, and Issei could not bring himself to mention that he, too, possessed a sacred gear. Such items were rare. Encountering one so soon after discovering his own felt like more than mere coincidence. A shiver ran through Issei, followed by a cold sweat, and he announced that they had arrived when he spotted the church at the corner. The place felt nostalgic to him. It had once been cared for by the family of his friend Irina before they moved abroad. Since then it had been left neglected. Issei wondered why a young nun would be sent alone to such a worn building, although there was light inside as if renovations were underway. Asia exclaimed with enthusiasm that this was the place and that she was so happy. Issei hesitated, then sighed and said he would go on his way. Asia quickly asked him to wait and offered to make tea to thank him for bringing her. He hesitated again, remembering he had not been inside the church since Irina left. He had liked the childish belief that as long as he did not go back to check, the place would remain as he remembered it and Irina would somehow still be there. He did not want to confront the truth with his own eyes. The church's strong holy aura made his body tremble slightly, a sharp contrast to his now demon-tainted aura. Apologizing, he declined, explaining he had an important errand and could not stay. Asia looked disappointed enough that Issei almost changed his mind. On impulse, he took her hand and introduced himself as Hyoudou Issei, adding that his friends called him Ise and inviting her to call him the same. Asia answered with a bright smile and asked him to call her Asia. He told her that since they were friends now there was no need for formality. Then, with a courteous smile and a gentle squeeze of her hand, he expressed that it had been a pleasure to meet her and that he hoped they would see each other again. Asia continued to smile and blushed slightly. Issei found her endearing. Ria spoke in a categorical voice and told Issei not to approach that church again. Issei had expected the warning. After feeling the holy aura of the place, he had suspected she would say something like that. Rias had already mentioned that holy sites made demons uncomfortable, and he now understood what she meant. Still, making such a fuss over an old abandoned church he had explored thoroughly as a child felt excessive. He blamed himself for bringing it up. He should have kept quiet. Rias continued firmly that he should not get involved with people from the church, and especially to avoid exorcists because they were the demon's primary enemies. She explained that their powers were supported by prayer and that the danger was even greater if an exorcist possessed a sacred gear. Such a confrontation would be like walking straight into death, she warned Issei by name. Issei answered softly that he understood, and Rias nodded in satisfaction. He truly understood. He had felt, in body and soul, the danger that holy places like that church represented. He understood, but that did not mean he would not return. He had sensed in Asia a loneliness similar to his own and wanted to help if he could. Still, he would not break his promise to Rias. She had forbidden him to go back, and he had said he understood, not that he accepted. He kept that subtle distinction to himself. Akino Himejima teased the club president, asking if she had finished scolding him. Rias asked if something had happened, and Akino replied seriously that they had received a hunting order from the Archduke. Rias fell silent for a moment, then looked at Issei and nodded, instructing everyone to prepare because they were all going. The group responded that they were ready. Rias asked Issei to pay close attention to what he would see. They would use this opportunity to give him another lesson about how the underworld worked. While the others prepared, Rias began to explain the concept of the wanderers, commonly called errants. The term covered several situations, and it was important for reincarnated demons to know and understand it, since they were the ones most affected. Errants were typically those who had once had a master but no longer did. Most were reincarnated demons. Some had turned away from their masters because of cruelty, others had become masterless due to the destruction of their peerage for various reasons. Survivors without a master, or those who refused a new one, were also considered errants. Most were not truly dangerous. They were solitary or lived in small communities, though they were often viewed with suspicion. He now understood why the fallen angel Don Hasik had called him an errant. Rias added that the term could also sometimes apply to an exorcist who had broken with the church while continuing their activities. By contrast, Rias explained that parasites were dangerous. These were errant demons who sought power at any cost, feeding on the life force of humans or other living beings to increase their own strength. Over time, they lost grip on themselves as their hunger grew, their minds became unstable and they changed into forms that no longer resembled humans. At that point they were lost. The same terms could sometimes be applied to exorcists who abandoned their teachings and began killing without distinction, often for pleasure. Whether a fallen angel could be called a parasite was debated, but most agreed a fallen angel was at least an errant. The line between errant and parasite was thin and often blurred. Aquino announced that they were ready, interrupting the lesson. Rias agreed and ordered them to move out. The members of the Occult Research Club gathered on the giant teleportation circle, and Issei, slightly confused, followed a moment later. To his surprise, they were all transported in front of an abandoned building. Rias smiled at his puzzled expression and briefly explained that, as their master, she could perform a teleportation escort, carrying members of her peerage with her by drawing on her own reserves. That was why Issei had been able to accompany them despite lacking the energy to teleport on his own. Rias then explained their task for the night. A demon parasite had managed to evade elimination and had taken refuge in Kuo, Rias's territory, and she had been ordered to eliminate it. The group entered the house cautiously and checked the surroundings. Kaneko reported with disgust the smell of blood and covered her nose. Rias smiled oddly and told Issei that this would be a good opportunity to show him how they fought. He should pay attention, this was part of his lesson. She would also use the chance to explain the different characteristics of servants. Issei accepted, raising a brow to show his mixture of perplexity and curiosity. Rias decided to begin with a short history lesson. Rias explained that there were 3 factions: demons, angels, and fallen angels. Represented aside, and centuries ago a fierce war had raged between them. The conflict had cost all 3 factions most of their forces and had ended in a forced truce with no clear victor. Since then, everyone had worked to maintain the status quo and prevent the war from resuming. Issei listened in silence, paying close attention. Rias went on to say that demons had not been spared, much of their population had been decimated. One demon had eventually introduced a miraculous solution to prevent their extinction, a system that allowed other beings to be reincarnated as demons, replenishing their ranks. That system was called Evil Peace. Issei repeated the name in his head, intrigued. Rias confirmed that the system was based on chess, a game long popular with demons. Masters were the king of their peerage, a role she held. From the king there were 5 notable classes: queen, knight, rook, bishop, and pawn. A complete evil piece set comprised 15 pieces, the same number as one side in a chess game, excluding the king since he or she was already a demon. Issei wondered aloud which piece he represented and what his characteristics would be. Rias began to answer, but a voice from the back of the building interrupted with a low, curious murmur about something foul and something appealing at once. Rias announced that the entity was the parasite demon Visser and declared their intent to eliminate it. The creature laughed in a crazed, echoing manner that filled the hall. A silhouette emerged from the shadows. Only the upper portion was visible at first, floating several meters above the ground. It bore a deceptively beautiful face that hid its true danger. Issei noticed the effect but kept his attention on the threat. Heavy footsteps sounded, revealing that the lower body belonged to a gigantic beast. The form was grotesque and clearly dangerous. Visser held a lance in each hand, projecting a more fearsome appearance than it might otherwise have had. Rias lamented how the parasite had abandoned its master and descended into madness, and declared that, in the name of Duke Gremory, she would be happy to eliminate it. Visser mocked Rias and threatened her with violence. Rias called out for Hyoudou. Hyoudou sprinted forward immediately. Rias noted for Issei that Hyoudou was a knight, and that those reincarnated as knights gained greatly increased speed. As if to prove it, Hyoudou's speed intensified dramatically. The difference was so great that Issei, despite his training in martial arts, found himself surprised and unsure he could track Hyoudou's movements with his eyes. Even with his experience, rivaling that raw speed would be difficult. The newcomer would likely win a straight fight unless Issei used all his tricks. Rias added that Hyoudou's chosen weapon was the sword. Issei reconsidered his chances, realizing an armed opponent changed the equation. He noted that while he had unarmed combat expertise and trained to face blades, he lacked the experience to rely on that fully in the present moment. A duel would probably end in a draw. Hyoudou halted suddenly, a European-style sword in hand. Issei wondered when or where he had produced it, but before he could think further, Hyoudou moved with blinding speed and struck. The parasite's forelimbs were severed, and the creature recoiled as the dismembered limbs fell heavily to the ground. Rias spoke with satisfaction about Hyoudou's power, describing the combination of extraordinary speed and professional swordsmanship that made him an exceptionally fast knight. Issei remained quiet but disagreed inwardly. He did not consider Hyoudou the single most dangerous combatant. He suspected Rias was exaggerating. Then he noticed another figure approaching the parasite's legs. Rias introduced Kaneko as a rook and began to explain her characteristics. The injured creature, enraged, attempted to crush Kaneko under a massive foot, swearing at her. Issei considered intervening but saw that Kaneko showed no worry and that others were holding their positions. He decided to watch how she would handle it. Kaneko met the descending threat with a detached expression, then lifted the monstrous foot, preventing it from coming down any further without appearing to exert much effort, while her opponent panted heavily. Rias explained that a rook's defining traits were tremendous strength and unusually high resilience. Rias explained that it was impossible for a demon of that caliber to injure Kaneko. No matter how hard it tried, it would not be able to crush her. To prove her king's assertion, Kaneko Tuju lifted the parasite's foot with ease, upsetting the creature's balance and sending its bulk hurtling backward. The sight was as impressive as it was unsettling. The force produced by such a small body was astonishing, and Issei would not have believed it if he had not seen it with his own eyes. Unlike with Hyoudou, Kaneko could probably break the monster in two if she caught it during a fight, though she did not appear especially fast, the opposite problem of Kiba. Still, the display had been both interesting and instructive. Rias then introduced Akino, her smile widening as she did. She explained that Akino Himejima was the club's vice president and served as Rias's queen. As a queen, Akino combined the traits of pawn, knight, bishop, and rook, making her the strongest of the peerage after Rias herself. The parasite groaned in pain as Akino approached. Akino moved with an oddly sweet tone and a calm amusement, teasing the creature as she assessed it. She lifted her hands toward the ceiling and yellow lightning began to gather in her palms, dancing between her fingers before leaping into the air and striking the parasite. The creature convulsed and screamed, smoke and sparks briefly rising from its body under the force of the attack. Akino continued her assault with a steady, controlled intensity, striking the creature again. The parasite writhed and howled, resistance steadily weakening. Rias remarked that Akino excelled at attacks focused on demonic energy. She could wield elements like ice or fire but had a clear preference for lightning. As queen, Akino also possessed a large reservoir of magic, and she displayed a pronounced enjoyment of dominating combat that bordered on sadistic in its relish. The assault continued for several minutes, the only sounds the crackle of electricity and the creature's fading cries, until the parasite had long since lost the will to fight. When the creature could do nothing more, Rias stepped forward and asked if it had any last words. The parasite, gasping, pleaded for death. Rias responded with cold resolve. A mass of dark energy formed in her palm and condensed into a tight, dangerous sphere. With a single, decisive release, the attack overwhelmed the parasite, consuming it in a blinding flash that left no trace behind. Issei watched, uneasy at the finality of the strike. Rias announced that the hunt was over and praised the team for their work. The parasite hunt had been fierce but had clearly favored Rias's peerage, which had suffered no damage. For Issei, the encounter had been a clear indication of the group's power. If parasites were supposed to be stronger than average demons because of their nature, then the members of the Occult Research Club were well above average. Issei then furrowed his brow and questioned Rias about something she had not yet told him. He asked what piece he had been assigned under the evil piece system. Rias smiled and explained the system, based on chess. Excluding the king, there were 15 pieces. Akino was the queen, Hyoudou was a knight, and Kaneko was a rook, leaving 1 knight, 1 rook, 2 bishops, and 8 pawns unaccounted for. Rias told Issei that he was a pawn. Issei blinked, then pointed out that in chess a pawn could be promoted. Rias confirmed that he was correct, acknowledging his understanding. The pawn possessed the ability promotion, which allowed it to become temporarily a queen, knight, bishop, or rook when it was in enemy territory or when its king granted permission. This was a peculiar trait of the pawn, not a passive characteristic but a special active power. That was also why the queen could not use promotion. Issei murmured that he understood, then, struck by a sudden idea, asked Rias, in her capacity as president, to grant him unlimited authorization to use promotion at will. Rias reacted with surprise and then smiled. She agreed to the request but warned that promotion could be taxing, even dangerous, to the body if it was not ready for the sudden influx of power. She explained that promotion was an active ability, unlike characteristics, which were passive. Issei promised that he would be careful. He meant it. He intended to exercise extreme caution while also experimenting with the ability, since it was precisely what he needed to advance in his twice critical tests.